Welcome to Build a Chat App with React, a premium course that shows you step-by-step how to build your own amazing, complete chat app where you can share text, media, and audio messages in real time. This course is a masterclass on building fully featured apps with React using the latest tools in Firebase to do it. To build our app, we'll dive deep into the most powerful parts of Firebase, including the Firestore real-time database, Firebase storage, authentication, rules, and hosting. On top of all that, we'll make an impressive interface for our users with the world's most popular component library, Material UI. And by the end, you'll have a complete chat app where users can talk with one another in public and private rooms live wherever they are in the world. This course is for anyone who wants to learn how to build truly epic apps with Firebase and React. Just click the link below to get started, and let's dive in. Let's take a quick look at the final version of the app that we're going to be building. This is entirely made with Next.js, and our app is powered by Firebase. We have a sign-in screen. Currently I'm logged out. We just need to click in the Sign In with Google button, and we have an option to sign in with social login. You can choose any social login that you like. So I'm going to log in with one of my accounts, and I'm taken to the home page. And right now, you can see we have a sidebar on the left-hand side and a main chat area here. We don't have any chats visible either on the sidebar or here, but we can go ahead and create one. We can create a room name, so I'm just going to make a test room name, maybe called coding. Then I can hit submit. You see that room was created, and we're taken to a new tab specifically for rooms. So these are all of the public rooms. So any user can type a message, can chat within a public room within our app. So we can add a message, a text message here, and we see the text itself as well as when it was posted. We can also add images, and this is being handled with Firebase storage. So we can choose some sample image. We see a preview of it here. Let me choose a slightly larger one. I'll choose this one. You can see the large preview that we have here, so we can take a look at this and we can close it out if we want. And you can also type an associated message, and then if we hit enter, we'll see a few seconds later we have that image uploaded, and we have in our message the image on top of the text. And then one last cool feature that we have is audio recordings. So if we click this button here in the bottom right-hand corner and we give our browser permission for this website to record, you can see here that we can start recording. We have a timer started. We can either cancel using the big X button here. We can cancel the recording, or if we hit the check mark, we see that it's being uploaded, and within a few seconds it's uploaded to Firebase storage, and we can play through it using this custom media player that we have. And the last few features that we have here is, so we have a room that we've typed into. Of course, other users can type in here. If we go back to the home tab, we can see all of our chats that we're active in. And we can also have private conversations with any other user. So we have another user in our app, and we can write them a message, and that's only being shown to them. This is as compared to our public room where every user can join them. And finally, we can search for any rooms or users that we like. So we can search for a specific room name, and it'll appear in the search results. And we can also search for a specific user as well, and it'll show up there too. And of course, in our app, we can log out. So with this brief preview of the final thing that we're going to be building, we have a better idea of what we're going to be making. And with that, let's dive into all the tools that we need in order to make this. There are a few things that you're going to need to have in order to build this chat app. The first is Node.js. If you don't have Node.js already installed, you can go to nodejs.org and download the long-term support version. Once you install Node, you'll be given npm, which we're going to use to install all of our dependencies and run our scripts. Make sure you have a good code editor. I'll be using Visual Studio Code, which you can grab for free at code.visualstudio.com. And finally, we're going to need to have a Firebase account. This account is entirely free to set up. It's very easy to set up if you already have a Google account. You'll just need to head to firebase.google.com and sign in with Google, and you can start creating a project for free. We'll get to the project creation part in just a bit, but just make sure that you have Node.js, a code editor, and with them installed, you should be all set to build this app. To build our chat app, we're going to be using probably the most powerful and convenient React framework, and that is Next.js. To get started with Next.js, you can use the create next app tool. To get started with it, you can just run the command npx create next app at latest. And you should be able to run npx once you have Node and therefore npm installed. So we can just copy this command, and I'm going to head to my code editor. I'm going to open up the terminal by going to View, Terminal, or using the Control and tilde shortcut. And on my desktop or wherever you want to create your project, you can cd into that folder. You can see I'm currently in my desktop, but if I wanted to go into it, I could just cd into that folder and then run the command npx create next app at latest. And after that, we just need to provide the name of our project. I'm going to be naming mine Epic Chat and hit enter. It's going to prompt you to install the following packages. We're going to hit enter or Y. We're going to go through the CLI and answer as follows. When we're asked to use TypeScript, we're not going to be using TypeScript for this project. We do want to use ESLint. So we're going to have some default linting rules that Next.js comes with, specifically through a dedicated ESLint package. And that's going to warn us or alert us about some things that we should and we shouldn't do as we build our project. So it's going to help us out. We're not going to be using Tailwind CSS. We're going to use Material UI as our component library. Would you like to use the source directory with this project? We're going to say yes. All of the code that we write is going to be within the source folder. So all of our import paths are just going to start with source, and it's going to make it a lot easier to import all of the files that we need. And we do not want to use the experimental app directory. We're going to use an import alias so we can write all of our imports starting from the same path. It's going to start with source, as you see here, source/*, which just means anything that follows source. So this is going to be an absolute path as compared to a relative path. We're going to hit enter. It's going to install all of our dependencies with npm. You can see it's installing ESLint and ESLint config next, along with React, React DOM, and the core Next library. And now all we need to do is take the folder that our project was created in, whatever we named it, drag it into our code editor, and we're ready to go. Let's run our newly created Next project. And if you head to the package.json file, you'll see that to start up our dev server, we just need to run the dev script. So we can, in our terminal, write npm run dev, and that's going to spin up a development server at localhost 3000. If you see this link here, you can just hit command and then click, or use control click based off of what operating system you're using, and you'll be taken to a working version, the default version of a Next app that's bootstrapped with the create next app tool. We're not going to have this ultimately, what we see here, in the final version of our app. So we want to make some changes. The first thing we'll do is we'll head to source. We can remove the API folder. We can delete this and all of its contents. If we head to index.js, we can collapse all of the JSX that's being returned. And for now, we're just going to replace this with a div with some dummy text. It really doesn't matter what you include. We're also going to remove the font here, the custom font that's coming from nextfont/Google. We're going to add our own custom font later, but in a different place. And we want to remove all of these imports. We don't need any of them right now. We see that we have a styles folder. We're going to go ahead and get rid of this. And we're also going to get rid of the public folder. So right now, we just have one page, which is all we're really going to have in our chat app. And if we head to the _app.js page, you'll see we have an import here. We're going to add back our styles folder and a globals.css file. And we're going to add back the public folder. To do that, we're going to download the attached assets. You You can see a link to these assets underneath this video. So just click the link and it's going to give you some assets that we need, or at least what we see in the deployed final version of our app, this icon here, as well as our background. And this assets folder comes with some other files that we need, including the globals.css file. So click the link below this video. When you're prompted to download a zip file, go ahead and do that. And when you have that zip file on your computer, we're just going to unzip it. And if we go into that folder, you'll see I've included in here a number of folders, a components, public, styles, and utils folder. We're going to take the components, styles, and utils folders and drag them all into our project, specifically into the source folder that you see here. So it should look like this. And then the public folder should be dragged into the root of our project. And if it's telling you to copy public or add public as a folder to the workspace, what we can do, because we don't want to have a workspace, set up a workspace here, we can just create a folder and we can just drag the contents into that. So what was included in this assets folder? Well, not very much. It includes all of the assets, all the base assets that we need for our final app, such as the background, logo, as well as a favicon. As for the components folder, where we're going to be listing all of our app components, it just consists of this audio player component. I've written all of this out for you in advance. This just gives us a nice player that will play back any recordings that we have. It would be tedious to create this on our own. And the same applies for what I've included in the styles folder. It includes all of the styles, the global styles that we need. If you go into it, you can see which component each set of styles is going to be used in. These are just simple CSS classes. It's going to make styling our app and having a styled app a lot easier. Doing so from scratch would be a course in and of itself, so we don't need to do that. And there's also this record audio utility function in the utils folder to make it possible to record audio from a microphone in the browser. So again, this is just as a convenience. A lot of this is simply boilerplate code. It's using the Media Recorder API. Feel free to dig into that if you like, if that interests you. And now that we have all of our base files, you should make sure that in your terminal you're not getting any errors. And if we head back to our application, we should just see the text home. And once you do, we're ready to move on to the next step of creating the main app page within our application. Before we dig into working with Firebase, let's set up some important things that our app needs to have, or at least we would like it to have, to add some polish to our final app. If we take a look at the final version of it, we're using a custom font here, a custom Google font. We're going to learn how to load custom fonts with no layout shift, with no flash of unstyled content or flash of unstyled text using the core Next library. And on top of that, we're going to add some metadata to our app, including the title and favicon. So where are we going to put all that? A good place to do this is within our main app or underscore app page that we have here. We're already importing the globals.css file, so we should be able to, when we start writing our UI, when we start creating elements and components, we should be able to apply the classes that are listed in globals.css and have them work, have them actually change the styles. What we need to do now is set up our custom font. And if we head to the Next documentation at nextjs.org/docs, we can take a look at Next font and specifically how to set that up. If we go to the Optimizing Fonts page, you'll see that there's an import in this example from next/font/Google. We can use this to import any font. You can see all of the free fonts available at fonts.google.com. Next font will give us the ability to import a function that will load any font here. The one that we're going to be using is one called Plus Jakarta Sans. So this could apply to anything that you look up on fonts.google.com. Even if it's not this specific font, feel free to choose whichever font you like. we now just need to import plus underscore Jakarta underscore sans. So if the font name has multiple words in it, those words are separated by underscores from next/font/Google. This is a function. This named import is a function, and we need to pass it a configuration object where we first set the subsets, which is an array of strings, and this determines essentially what alphabet we're using. So we're using the Latin alphabet, and additionally, for some fonts, you need to specify the weight, and that means what font weights you'd like to use. We don't need to use that here. We're going to be using a number of different weights, and when we call this function, we can get a reference to it that we can write in camel case, just like we would any JavaScript variable. And with this reference, we can now load our font very easily by first wrapping our component here. So I just copied the main component in our app. You can think of this app page as kind of rendering our whole component tree in our Next.js application. And I'm wrapping it in a main element. It really doesn't matter what element we choose. And we can set the class name property to plus Jakarta sans, or whatever the name of the font reference is, dot class name. And now when we hit save and head back, we should be able to see, it might be hard to see if this is just in a plain div and not in, say, an H1, the home text. If we were to make this just a little bit bigger, we can see that it is in fact a custom font being used. And if we look at the styles, we see it has a special font family that's set to plus Jakarta sans. And we can toggle it to see that it is in fact being loaded. So Next Font is a great help in very quickly adding performant fonts, or I should say performantly loading fonts in our application. And that's achieved through this subsetting, and it also preloads our fonts automatically. So we get a lot out of the box for free. And now to use another core Next.js feature, in particular a Next component called the head component, we can import that from next/head, and that allows us to set the head of our document and add metadata as we like. So in this case, we do not have a title like we do in the final version of our app, so we can just add a title element and name it what we like. Mine is going to be Epic Chat. You can see that that's updated. And keep in mind that we also have this favicon that we can use, and we can insert that with a link element which has a rel attribute set to icon with a type of image/x icon, and the href pointing to our public folder. And to reference our public folder, anything in our public folder, we just say / and then include the name of the file or folder that it starts with. In this case, it's favicon.ico. When we save that, you may or may not see your favicon. If you don't, it's probably due to your browser's cache. To invalidate that and to actually see your favicon, you can just add a query string of $v = 1, which is a nice little trick to make sure that your favicons appearing as you would expect. The head component's pretty straightforward. Feel free to add any additional meta tags, metadata that you like. This is just something to get us started. And now that we have a good base for our application, let's move on to integrating our app with Firebase so that we can create our login component and sign in our users. Our app is going to be powered by Firebase. This is something that we could categorize as a backend as a service. It's really impressive with all of the different services that Firebase includes. It gives us so many different things, and we're going to be using a lot of them in creating our app. In particular, we're going to be using their dedicated database, a real-time database called Firestore, storage to store all of our audio recordings and images, that's called Firebase Storage, as well as Firebase hosting and authentication. And that's going to take care of hosting our app, deploying it to the web, and authenticating our users respectively. So if you head to firebase.com or firebase.google.com, make sure you have a Google account first, and you probably already do. Once you log in, you'll be able to go to your console, and from there we can add a new project. So we're going to add our project name. I'm going to call mine Epic Chat, hit continue. You can certainly add Google Analytics for this project. It doesn't require any setup, and you get a bunch of useful data points for your app. This is going to be helpful, especially if you push it to production and you want other users to be able to interact with it. We'll then hit create project, and after about a minute or so, our project should be ready. We can hit continue. And the next step is to add Firebase to our app. There's some options for a bunch of different types of applications. We want the one in the middle here, this option, the web option, which we're going to click on. So we want to register our app. We can give our app a nickname. It really doesn't matter what it is. We could call it Epic Chat again. We're not going to set up Firebase hosting for this app at the moment. We're going to set it up later towards the end of a project, but we will be hosting our Next.js app with Firebase. We'll hit register app. We're going to use Firebase through NPM. We're going to use the Firebase NPM package. So the first step that we're going to take is we're going to head back to our project, and in our terminal, we can open a new terminal tab by hitting the plus button here. We want to install a specific version of Firebase. We just want to lock down the versions of the dependencies that we installed to make sure that everything works for you, no matter what time in the future you're creating this. So we want to run the command npm-i, or install Firebase at 9.20.0. You can confirm that that was installed successfully by heading to your package.json file, and you should see a new entry here with that specific versioning. Now that we have Firebase in our app, we can go to the next step and figure out how to initialize our app. We can go ahead and copy this code snippet here, and we're going to be using Firebase version 9, as you saw in the version that we installed, and this allows us to use the modular JavaScript SDK. This is a big improvement over version 8, over past versions of Firebase when working with the SDK. The SDK just allows us to integrate Firebase with our app. This modular version, number 9, allows us to really reduce the amount of code that Firebase includes in our final built version of our project. We can select exactly the modules, exactly the services that we want, so that we can reduce the amount of JavaScript and therefore improve the experience for our users because they don't have to load as much. And if we head to the link that was included at the very bottom, we can see how version 9 works, how this modular approach works. I'm going to scroll down a bit here. We'll be given our Firebase config with all the specific credentials associated with our unique Firebase project. And then it's going to allow us Firebase, that is the Firebase NPM package that we installed. It will give us a function to initialize our app. So we'll pass our entire Firebase config to this initialize app function. And then we can call these different functions, say from Firebase storage or Firebase/Firestore, these different modules that allows us to explicitly declare we want to set up storage and interact with it, Firestore, which is the database, and interact with it, and not use anything else from Firebase. Now that we've copied all of this code here, we can head to our project, and specifically we're going to go into the source folder, into the utils folder, and add a new file called firebase.js and paste all the code that we have here. We're going to start by initializing Firebase, as you see in this code comment, using the initialize app function, but we want to include a quick check to make sure that we don't initialize our app multiple times. This could cause performance issues. So there's a helper function called getApp, so we can also import from Firebase/app, and we can write a simple ternary here. We still are going to have the app variable, but we're going to say getApps. We're going to call this as a function, and we want to get the length property of it. So this is just going to return any initialized apps, and if it's 0, meaning our app isn't initialized, we can write a ternary by adding a question mark and say we do want to call that initialize app function because it hasn't been initialized yet. Otherwise, we want to take the first app that's been initialized. This returns an array. We want to grab that array and get the 0th, that is the first element. And now with this app reference, you can see we now have a reference to Firebase app, we can set up all of the different services that we need, the services that we're going to be using. So I'm going to remove these comments here. We're going to start by importing get Firestore from Firebase/Firestore. We'll go to the end of our file and we're going to create a DB variable. So this is going to be a reference for our database. And each of these services are going to be set up by taking that function, that getter function, and passing a reference to our app. So now we can work with our Firestore database and our app client. Let's do the same thing for auth and storage. So we'll import get auth from Firebase/auth. We'll create an auth variable, call get auth, and pass app to it. And next we'll grab get storage from Firebase storage, Firebase/storage. We'll create a storage variable and call get storage and pass app to that. And one last variable that we'll create is going to be called provider. This is going to be the Google Auth provider from the Firebase/auth import. This is for the next step where we're going to allow users to log in with Google Auth. And we just want to take that and set it equal to provider by saying new Google Auth provider. Be aware that there are tons of different authentication strategies, authentication providers. Feel free to use any of them in this variable. Google Auth just happens to be the easiest since Firebase is a Google service. And then finally, we're going to export within an object all of these references: DB, auth, storage, and provider. And at this point, we can now very easily, from this one file, reference all of the different Firebase services that we'll be using anywhere we need throughout our app. Now that we have our Firebase project created, we've integrated Firebase with our app, let's move on to creating our login component. We're going to be using Material UI, which is a component library, in order to create a lot of pieces of our app. You can find documentation, learn everything about it at mui.com. When you're on the home page, you'll see a quick snippet to copy that includes all the dependencies that you need to get started with Material UI. We're not only going to install Material UI, the component library, but also the icons. There's a set of Material UI icons that work really well with all of these different components. So let's begin in our terminal and once again run npm i, and we're going to use @emotion/react, which is a peer dependency of Material UI. So we're not going to be directly using it, but Material UI needs it. We'll install emotion/react at 11.10.6, as well as emotion/styled at 11.10.6. And then the core Material UI library will come from @mui/material at 5.12.1. And the icon library will come from @mui/icons-material at 5.11.16. Just make sure when you perform this installation that you have prefixed for each of these dependencies. And when that's done, we're going to start with the home page by adding a new component in our components folder called login. So we'll create login.js, and to create our component, we will export default function. So this is going to be a function component with the name login. And right now, let's just return a div with the text login. And to see that we've set up everything correctly, we'll go into pages and head to index.js. And instead of our home h1, let's return our login component from source/components/login. And if you're using VS Code, you should have this suggestion here that we can click on or hit tab, and that will automatically add our import up at the top. So make sure that we save both of these files. On our home page now in our app, we should just see the text login. But we actually want it to look like our final version here with a background, our logo, sign in text and a button. And this button is coming from Material UI. So we can head to the components documentation if you're on the MUI site and take a look at what's required for that. We just need a button import there. We'll begin within login. If you are on your home page, if you're in your home page file, if you just hover over your login component, you can use Command or Control and then click to jump to that component. And we'll replace our div here with a div that has the class name app. Within that, a div with the class login. And in that, a div which is going to serve as our background, and it's going to cover the whole screen. This will have the class name login __ background. Our classes will conform to the BEM syntax with underscores and hyphens, if you're familiar with that syntax, if you've written CSS that way. And so far, if we were to save that, we can now see a nice background image covering our whole login component, our whole page. And then after, or as a sibling to our background, we'll have div with the class login __ container. And this is the card that our logo, text, and button will be placed in. We'll start with an image. We're just going to use a plain image element, not an image from next image. And the reason for that, without getting too far ahead of ourselves, is because next image doesn't work so well with Firebase hosting. You could certainly use the built-in next image component if you wanted to, and if you're deploying to something like Vercel or Netlify. We're going to set the source of this image to / and therefore in our public folder logo.png, and we'll add some alt text to just say this is our logo. As a sibling to that div and underneath it in our login component, we'll have a div with the class login __ text. This will contain an h1 with the text content sign in to Epic Chat. And then after that div, we will include a button. And this will be from MUI/material. The component library is really easy to get up and running with. There's tons of examples on the official website. You can see here all of the different variants that we have for a basic button. We want this to be pretty bold and stand out, so we want to use just a basic button as compared to a text button. You could also use a contained button. We're just going to use a plain one and say sign in with Google. And when we save and take a look at what we have, it looks identical to the final version. And with that done, our next step will be to make this sign in with Google button functional to actually authenticate our user and then allow them to access the app. On its own, Firebase has a really powerful API for each of its individual services. If we head to firebase.google.com/docs/Firestore, you'll be able to see all the documentation to start working with our database. You can also see a section for the real-time database, which we won't be using. That's just important to clarify. We're just going to be using Firestore, which is kind of the newer version of the real-time database, and it offers a ton of similar features. It's going to give us real-time functionality, so our users can see chat in real time. And there's also sections for authentication as well as storage. We're going to be making use of this, but we're also going to use a very helpful utility library that makes working with Firebase easier within React applications. And that is React Firebase hooks. If you do a quick Google search, you should be able to find not only an NPM link, but a GitHub link. And if you head there, you'll be able to see how to get started with React Firebase hooks. You'll see the dependency here, React-Firebase-hooks, and it includes at the very bottom a bunch of documentation for working with all of the different services that we're going to be using, namely authentication, Firestore, as well as cloud storage. We're going to get started with the authentication hooks. And if you take a look at the different auth hooks that are available, you'll see there's a use sign in with Google hook. If we look at the signature of this, it accepts the auth, the auth instance that we created in our firebase.js file, this auth variable. Just like any React hook, we call it at the top of our function component, and we get back a bunch of information. But what's going to be most important for us is this first element. So it returns to us an array, and we can immediately destructure sign in with Google, this function that's going to take care of actually starting the login process. So we're going to head back to our login component, we'll jump into it, and we want to import use sign in with Google. We want to import that from a library that we don't have, so we're going to need to npm install React Firebase hooks, and we're going to specify the version as 5.1.1, and once that's successfully installed, we can import use sign in with Google from React Firebase hooks /auth. We also want to import our auth variable from source utils Firebase. We're going to be importing from that file quite a lot, and again, referring to our documentation, we're going to get back an array where we're just going to need to destructure the sign in with Google function. And just like any button, we can add to our material UI button an onClick and then call a function. So we'll write an inline arrow function. We're in the return, we're simply going to call sign in with Google. Now, before testing this out, and of course we can save and make sure that we're not getting any errors, before we attempt to sign in, we're going to need to head back to Firebase. We're going to continue to our console if we haven't already, and we'll go to the authentication section. You should see a big link here, and you want to click on the Get Started button. It's going to allow us to set up Firebase Auth by picking a provider. You'll see that there's some native providers where the user can directly specify their own information, such as email and password, phone. You can even use anonymous login. This is really helpful for, say, native applications. In our case, we're going to be using the Google provider here, and there are even more providers available than the ones that you see in this section. So we can just click on Google, and we want to then, in the sign in method tab, we should see the Google option, as well as an option to enable it. So we'll toggle that switch, and we can choose a public facing name, and in this case it might make sense to name it what our official app name is, such as Epic Chat, and then we need to choose a project support email. And once you've provided that, you can just hit save, and we now see a summary of all of our enabled sign-in providers, and we have the ability to add additional ones as well. And now we're able to test out sign in with Google. We can click on the button, and we can now choose an account to log in with. And once that process is finished, we won't see anything immediately happen, but we can go back to authentication and specifically go to the users tab and see that we now have a new user created, as well as a bunch of metadata on that user. There's a bunch more than this, but you see at least some basic information such as providers. They used Google to sign in, and it kind of doubles as an account creation as well as a sign in for returning users, as well as when their account was created, when they signed in, and their user ID. Something important to understand when working with Firebase is that when we authenticate users with Firebase Auth, we need to, in many cases, and most applications that you make, you want to have that authentication data synced with your database. So just to be clear, this user that we logged in with, this information is only within the authentication service. We need to find a way to take that newly signed in user and then add them to our database, to Cloud Firestore. So we're going to go to Cloud Firestore, and we're going to choose Create Database. When we start working with Firestore, we don't want to start in production mode. What this will do is disable all reads and writes, and it's going to make our app private by default. It's only going to be possible, therefore, to get documents, to get data from our database, and to add data to our database if we were to add it directly within the Firebase console. We don't want that. We want to enable all reads and writes, and we're going to see at the end of the course, when we get to the point of deployment, how to actually lock down our app specifically for authenticated users to make sure everything, all the operations are safe, that we're not going to allow any unauthenticated access to our database to make changes. But for right now, since nobody else knows about it and we're just in development, we want to start in test mode, which is going to enable all reads and writes for a limited time. So we want to choose that option, and we want to choose a Cloud Firestore location. We can only choose this once. You want to choose a location that's close to yourself and where you think your users are going to be. There's a bunch of different options that you can choose around the world. Once you've made that choice, you'll hit enable. Firestore is what's known as a NoSQL database. You can kind of think of it as not the most structured database, kind of similar to MongoDB if you've ever used it. We can really make the database in any structure that we like. There are a few rules, but what I mean by any structure is the documents, the individual records in our database can have any items on them that we like. And the way that Firestore works is it works by having a relationship between collections and documents. So what do I mean by that? Well, once we have our provisioned database, we can start a collection. We can manually create a collection. And you can think of a collection in plain JavaScript as just an array of objects. The collection is the array. And we can give our collection an ID. In fact, we need to give them an ID. And in our case, when we sync our authentication users with our database users, we're going to have an ID specifically called users. This is just test data. You don't need to go ahead and do this yourself. And our collection, our array, is going to be linked with individual documents. And those are the objects in our array. Our collection is linked to individual documents by a document ID. And you can set this manually, or you can let Firebase create it for you. We can use the auto ID function to just automatically generate an ID. And the object fields are kind of like the keys on an object. And for example, we're going to have a name field on each of our users. And it's going to be of type string, so you can specify a number of different values, a number of different data types, and it would make sense to have a string here, say, with the value John. We're going to have other fields as well, but once we save this, you'll see how this structure, this relationship between collections and documents exists. So we have our top-level collection. It's linked to an individual document by an ID. So if we were to add another unique document with a unique ID with the same name field, you can see that it's connected by a different ID. It links this ID, links our collections, our array, to our documents, which again we can think of as objects. But what's neat about Firestore is that we can also have sub-collections as well. So if we wanted, and we are in fact going to have this, we could have a sub-collection. You can see the path here. We're starting with an individual document, but we can have on that document another collection. So a particular user might have, and this is something that we won't exactly have, but we might have a messages collection. And then that can be linked to its own document, say with its own text of whatever. We can save that. We can see, so you can see in a nutshell how this works. Now, of course, we're not going to be adding documents and collections like this through the console. We're going to be adding them dynamically using the Firebase SDK. So I'm going to go ahead and delete everything, delete my document, and delete this user's collection as well. So we're just going to start from scratch. Now, the way that we're going to access our user data in our app can again be found in the React Firebase hooks documentation. If you scroll up, you'll see there's an option, there's a particular hook called use auth state, and that's at the very top. We're going to again use the auth module, pass it to this hook, and we're going to get back our user. And this is something that's going to be used in a custom hook that we're going to make That's going to allow us to sync our auth user, again, from Firebase authentication, and we're going to see how to write some code to be able to sync that data with our Firestore database. This is all going to be located within a custom hook in a dedicated hooks folder. So within source, we're going to make a folder called hooks, and we'll have a file there, use auth user. And to write our hook, we're going to, again, export default a function, but we're going to make sure to write this in camel case, use auth user. And we're going to import the use auth state function. Hopefully you have an autocomplete suggestion from React Firebase hook /auth, and then we're going to pass in auth from our Firebase file. Once again, we're not going to need to destructure all of these values. We're just going to need the user data. So we can go ahead and delete the loading and error references. So now that we have our user, let's just go ahead and within useEffect, we'll see why we're using useEffect in a second, we're going to listen or detect whenever any changes to user is made. So if we have a user, this function is going to run. And right now we just want to console log user, and we want to return it from this hook. And use auth user is going to be called at the top level of our app within our index page. So we want to go to index.js within pages and call use auth user, not use auth state. Right now we just want to call this. We don't want to get the return user. We don't need to at this point. And when we open our console, we'll right click and hit inspect and go to our console. You'll see being logged from use auth user, we have a bunch of information, a ton of information about the user that's currently logged in from Firebase auth. Now what we want to do here within useEffect is we want to check and see if this user exists in our database. And we're going to be using the Firestore SDK. So if we head to the documentation, we can get started by looking at how to read data and how to get data now that we've initialized Firestore with get Firestore. If we scroll down a bit, you'll get a sense of how we're going to be able to get individual documents. So this will work for both documents and collections. It will be a little strange at first writing these, but we're going to do a lot of this. We're going to work with documents and collections a lot and figure out how to get them, to query them in our app. So this is going to be familiar over time, but we're going to be first doing what's called creating a reference. We're going to create a reference to a document. And in our case, we want a reference to a user in our users collection. Again, that doesn't exist yet, so we're not going to get back anything. But the way to get a document once we have a reference, so we create a reference, then we're going to call this getDoc function, and it's going to allow us to get what's called, or what Firestore calls a snapshot. And this snapshot is going to include information about this document. And we're going to check to see if it exists using this exists method. If it does exist, we're going to be able to get its data. Otherwise, we're going to know that no document exists. So that was a lot. So let's walk through this within useauth user step by step. We're first going to check and see if we have a user, and we know that we do. We want to create a user ref, and we're going to use for a document, since this is an individual record, an individual user, we're going to use the doc function. This comes from Firebase/Firestore. So we will import doc, and the first thing that we need to include is a reference to the root Firestore instance. So that's just DB. Let's make sure to import that from our firebase.js file. Next, we want a reference represented by a string to the document. And the way that we're going to set up all these references between our users collection and an individual document is we're going to connect the users collection. I'm just going to write a comment here. We're going to have our users collection, and it's going to be linked to an individual document, our user document, via a ID, specifically the user ID, and you can see it on the UID property. If we take a look at what was returned, we see UID here at the very end, and that's what we also saw in our authentication section when we took a look at our authenticated user. So how's this going to look? Well, we're going to write a string, a template string, using backticks, and we're going to say /users, and then we're going to insert user.uid from the user that we have here. Okay, now we have a reference. We have a reference to our user. Now we want to get the document. We want to get it and check to see if it exists. So we're going to import getDoc and pass in our user reference. GetDoc, as we saw in the documentation, returns a promise. So that allows us to await it. We can't use await, or we shouldn't use await within a function, the effect function in useEffect, so we can use a then callback. Here we're going to get a reference to a snapshot. We can also refer to this just as the plain document if we like, but for now I'm just going to use snapshot. We're going to get our snapshot, and remember there's this exists method on it. And we want to say, using a conditional, we're going to say if not snapshot.exists, make sure to call this as a method, don't use it as a property. We want to set a document. We want to add a new document. So if we scroll up a little bit, you'll see where we can set a document. Now there's two ways to add a document to our database. One is the setDoc function, and this requires an ID of some sort. The addDoc function, let me see if I can find that. The addDoc function, on the other hand, requires a collection reference, not an individual document. And the reason is that addDoc does not require an ID. It auto-generates it, as you saw with that auto-generate button in our Firestore console. So in our case, we're going to add a new user, and we know that we want to connect it by their user ID. So we're going to use setDoc instead of addDoc. We're going to import setDoc, and the cool thing is that since we've attempted to fetch this document, we have on the ref property a reference, the reference that we included here, so that we don't have to write it again. So the reference is the first argument, and then after that we include an object, and this is going to be all of the data that we want put on the document, the document to create. So we're going to have a name property. If we look at our console, we'll see that there's a display name, which we'll use as the name property. We have a URL or photo URL, and we also want to create a timestamp. We'll get to that in a second, but for now we're going to say user.displayName for the name property. Photo URL is user.photoURL, and we also want to know when this user is created with a timestamp property, and we can use a helper function, server timestamp, which will import from Firebase/Firestore, and this is what's going to tell Firestore to create a timestamp on the server, and this needs to be called as a function. Now with all this, we can save useAuthUser, and when we head back to our app, we might need to refresh. We can then go to our Firestore database, and when we refresh that, we'll see a new users collection. We'll see a ID linking to a new document, and if we go back to our authentication section, we can see that the user UID should be the same as the ID that we see here, and we have all of the fields that we specified, the name, the photo URL, and the timestamp. So our timestamp was in fact created properly. That was a lot to cover, but now we have a good basic sense of collections, documents, how to reference them, how to get them, and how to create them now within our Next.js application. We're going to spend a lot of time working with collections and documents, querying them, adding new documents. But before we get to that, let's build out the basic structure of the app for our authenticated users. We're now authenticating users, syncing them with our database. Let's build out a basic sidebar here before we get to the main chat area. Now that we know our use auth user hook is working, we can grab the actual user within our home page. And instead of just showing the login component in every case, we obviously only want to show that if we don't have an authenticated user. If no user, then we're going to return the login component. Otherwise, we're going to return a div that has the class app. That will have a child div with the class app __ body. And we're going to begin with a new component that we haven't created, a sidebar component. So within our components folder, we'll create sidebar.js. We'll start by exporting with export default a sidebar component. And we're going to begin by adding the header area up at the top. And you can see we have the user's photo URL or avatar, their name, a log out button, a sign out button, the search input, which will be within a form. And then we're going to have our main area here where we're going to be able to toggle between chats, rooms, users, and then the search results. And then at the very bottom, you'll have a button to create a new room. For now, let's just create the header, search area, this main area here, not including the tabs and the links, and finally our button. Just one quick thing before we dive into building all those individual elements. We want to pass down all of our user data to our sidebar. So we'll add a prop called user and just set that equal to our user data, and then immediately destructure user from the props object within our sidebar component. And with that out of the way, we can return a div with the class sidebar. This is going to be the main container div. We'll start with our header. So here we'll have a div. Just write a quick comment here that's to indicate it's our header. We'll have a div with the class sidebar __ header. Within that will be a div with the class sidebar __ header -- left. We're going to use the avatar component from MUI material. You can check out the documentation on how to additionally configure that, but it's pretty nice out of the box. It gives us a rounded avatar as well as a fallback according to the text if it's not able to load. So we're going to first set the source to user.photo URL that we got from the Google login from Firebase auth, and we're going to set our alt text to user.display name. Remember to use the property names according to Firebase auth, not according to our database. So this should be display name and not user.name. And then after the avatar, we'll have a sibling h4 with the text content user.displayname. Now, my practice is to often use this optional chaining operator, but referring to the code that we already wrote, we're going to for sure have a user when we're working within the sidebar component because we have this conditional. And the optional chaining operator just helps us make sure that we don't throw an error if we, for example, had null instead of the user data here, but we don't need this. That's just my habit to always include that when I'm working with data that I'm fetching from somewhere. Then as a sibling to sidebar header left, we're going to have another div with the class sidebar header right. This will include an icon button component from MUI material. And for an icon button, we need to pass as a child an icon. And remember, this is coming from any icons that we write are coming from MUI icons material. And we're going to import one called exit to app. So if we, for now, save all this and make sure to import our sidebar and take a look at its appearance so far, first of all, making sure that we've signed in, we now see the user's image, their name, and a logout button. Next, we're going to write some JSX to include a search form. So after our header here, we'll have a search section. This will consist of first a div with the class sidebar __ search. Within this will be a form element with the class sidebar search - dash dash container. This will first consist of a search outlined icon, and as a sibling to that, an input where users will type in their search query, and it'll have the type text, the ID search, and we want some placeholder text set to search for users or rooms. So now we have a search area here, and beneath that we'll add our create room button. This will start with a div with the class sidebar chat dash dash add room. This will consist of an icon button as well, and this will have as a child the add icon, so we'll make sure to import that, of course. And now, because of our CSS, we have our floating button here on the bottom right hand side of our sidebar. And at this point we have a good base for our sidebar. We're now showing our authenticated app, and in the next step we'll see how to add our menu here, add these different tabs, as well as a list of results underneath. Now let's move on to the content of our sidebar. As we know, we're going to have chats that our users, currently authenticated users, active in and participated in, all of the public rooms, as well as all of the users that the current user can chat with, meaning not them. We're going to see in future lessons how to create all these with actual data from our database. But at the moment, we need to have some dummy data to populate this as we create the basic structure of our component here. So right now, within our sidebar component, I'm just going to make a variable called data, and this is going to be a dummy array of objects. And for our rooms or users that we're going to be displaying, they're at least going to consist of visibly a name and an avatar. So at the moment, I'm just going to have a dummy ID, a name of something, it could be John Doe, it really doesn't matter, and a photo URL. You don't have to have a photo URL, but if you're able to grab one from the currently authenticated user that you have, probably in your database at this point, you can go ahead and copy that image address. And with that, we're going to be able to create a component called our sidebar list, as well as our menu. Now our menu is going to consist of these different tabs to display the same component but with different data. So let's start with creating these tabs. As you can see, there's no text associated with it. It just consists of an icon, and we have an underline underneath it if it's active. So to detect whether a tab is active, we're going to have some dedicated state, and for that, we're going to bring in the useState hook from React. The default value is going to be 1. The tab is going to be associated with a given integer, 1 through 4. And we're going to name this state variable menu, and the setter will be set menu. Now, we're going to start with an array of tabs. Since we have something repeating here, we have the same structure, we can just abstract this into an array of objects where we have an ID of 1, and again this is the menu ID, and its associated icon, which for the first tab is going to be the home icon. So we want to import the home icon from MUI icons material, and we'll add 2 more objects to this array. We'll have an ID of 2 and 3 with the icons message and people alt respectively. So with this tabs array, we're going to head down below our search area here, and we're going to create a div to hold all these tabs with the class sidebar underscore underscore menu, and we're going to map over each tab, and we're going to return a new component called a sidebar tab, which we'll create in our components folder. Now, the question is, before we jump into this file, what do we want to pass down? Well, first of all, we need to use a key. Since we're iterating over this component, we need to provide a key set to tab.id. We're also going to provide an onClick, so we're going to pass down a callback function where we're going to set the menu to tab.id. So this allows us to change the currently active menu. And we're also going to pass down a prop called isActive, where we're going to say if the tab ID is equal to the value in state, the menu piece of state, then it's going to be active and will show the underline here, the border here, and also show the appropriate data. Now, sidebar tab is not going to be a self-closing component. We're going to instead accept children between the opening and closing tags. And specifically, we're going to accept a div with the class sidebar menu home. And inside that div, we will insert the icon, which we wrote, as you could see here, as a component. And then as a sibling of that, we'll have a div with the class menu, or rather sidebar menu line. Then if we head to our sidebar tab component, we'll again create a component which will export with the same name. And we want to return a div with the class according to the value of isActive on the props object. So we'll make sure to grab all of the different props that we're passing down on click, isActive, and children. The class is going to be determined by the value of isActive. So we'll write a template string where we say isActive. If that's true, we'll use the class sidebar menu selected. Otherwise, just an empty string. And we'll add an onClick to this div and just pass a reference to the function that we're passing down as a prop. And then finally, we'll insert the children via the dedicated children prop, just like this. So now we can save sidebar tab. We will make sure to import that component within our sidebar component. And now we have tabs that we can select. We see our state is being updated, the style of it's being updated appropriately. And what remains is to dynamically change the content based off of that menu state. To show the appropriate content, we're going to head back to sidebar, and above the Create Room button, we'll add a ternary, in fact a few ternaries, to say if the menu is equal to one or another number, one or another integer, 1 through 4, we want to show the sidebar list component, which we haven't created yet, and then pass down a different title and different data to it. We'll begin by creating a sidebar list component. We'll export default function sidebar list. And the first thing that we're going to return will be a div with the class sidebar chat container. That'll contain an h2, and we want to receive a title. We haven't passed that down yet as a prop, so we'll just write title at the moment. And then we want to include our data that's being passed down as well. So we know that we're going to have two props, title and data. And if we don't have any data, we want to show a loading spinner, probably because when we're fetching on the client, we may not have that data yet. We might be in the process of fetching or loading. So if we don't have anything at the moment, we just want to return a div with the classes loader underscore underscore container and sidebar underscore underscore loader. And this will include a circular progress component. So it'll give us a nice little loading spinner without any additional configuration. So we're not displaying our data just yet. Let's just display our title and write our ternary here within our sidebar component. If the menu is equal to 1, we want to display the chat's title, and we're using just the same dummy data now. We will update that as we create some custom hooks to display and to fetch different data. But we're going to start with sidebar list with the title set to chats and the data set to data. We can copy this to make it a bit easier. And then we're going to add an or, the colon, to our ternary, and then add another ternary, chain another one onto it and say if menu is 2, we want to set the title of that component to rooms. If menu is 3, we'll set the title to users. If menu is 4, we'll set the title to search results. And then finally, if for some reason menu is not equal to any of these numbers, we just want to return null. So if we save sidebar list and sidebar, we see that we're now displaying a title up at the top, but we're not changing its content. So we can use the title being passed in via props, and the title changes, but now we want to show the data that we're passing down. We know that data is an array of objects, so we can simply say data.map, and for each item, we want to return a sidebar list item. We haven't created this component. Let's go ahead and do so in our components folder. We'll export default sidebar list item, and we want to pass down, after adding the key, as item.id, an item prop set to item. And we're using a generic name because data could be a number of different things. It could be users or it could be rooms. So let's make sure to, first of all, in our new component, destructure item. And as you recall, for both rooms and users, we're going to have an avatar on the left-hand side as well as the text. And this will all be a clickable link. We'll begin by returning a link component, and this is going to come from next link. It'll have the class name of link. And we want to set the href not to a different page. We're just going to set it to /, but we're going to add on the query parameter using the question mark room ID, just like this. And we're going to set it equal to item.id. This is going to allow us to fetch the data according to what room we're in. It allows us to easily fetch a document with all of its messages. Within that link, we're going to have a div that has the class sidebar chat. That will have a child div with the class avatar container, which will again include an avatar from material, where we're going to set the source to item.photo URL, or, and this is pretty neat, we're going to use a resource called DiceBear to give us an auto-generated avatar in the event that we don't have a photo URL. So the link to this, we can just include a link of https avatars.dicebear.com/api/item.id.svg. And we're going to add some additional styles of a width set to 45 pixels and a height set to 45 pixels. And as a sibling to the avatar container, we'll have a div with the class sidebar chat info that has an h2 as a child, where we'll display the item name. So making sure that we've imported sidebar list item in sidebar list, we can save that and also save sidebar list item. And if we take a look, we now see our dummy chat. It should be the same in all of our tabs. But with that, we now have the UI of our sidebar almost entirely complete. Now we just need to add the functionality and make sure that we're able to fetch the appropriate data to be displayed here. Now, to actually display real data in our sidebar, we need to be able to create it. So let's make our create room button functional. And in our final app, we saw that we could create a dialog. And this is being created, being displayed with Material UI. So let's head to the documentation if you have it open. If you don't, that's fine. And we can head down to the dialog component. It's going to make it possible to create a dialog. And if we scroll down, we'll see that we could create what's called a form dialog. And this is essentially just going to consist of an input where the user can type in the name of the new room that they want to create and create it, or hit cancel to close out of it. You could also click away from the dialog as well. There's a bunch of ways to customize this. Again, what I make is going to be pretty simple. Feel free to customize it to your heart's delight. You can see a basic version of what we're going to be creating here if you go to the forms dialog section and you take a look at all this. You'll see that it starts with a dialog component, a dialog title up at the top, and then after that, a content component that consists of text and then a text field. So we can go ahead and copy all of this. Again, it's pretty simple. You can write this all out if you want. We're going to make some modifications, but we're going to paste this into our sidebar component, and it's going to go directly underneath the create room button. So this is going to be our create room dialog. We'll paste this in and make sure that we are importing everything that we need here. We're going to import dialog, dialog title, dialog content text, as well as text field and dialog actions and the button. We're going to get started by removing any references that don't exist. We're going to get rid of the on click here. We'll get rid of the open prop. We're going to need this, but we can just set this to false for right now. And we're also going to remove on close. On close is what's going to control the visibility of our dialog. So making sure that we have everything imported and we don't have any references that don't exist from that example. If we provide the value of true here and head back to our app, we can see a really big modal, a really big dialog. And we can fix the width of this with the help of the max width prop. We can set it to some different values from XS, extra small, to extra large. I'm going to set mine to small to make it a little bit smaller in size and constrain its width just a little bit. There are some additional, as we know with just about everything in Material UI, there are some additional options that we can customize. For example, the text field can be a different variant. We have outlined, filled, and standard. I'm going to go with the filled variant instead of standard. I'm also going to add some styles, so be aware that you can add classes or inline styles as you like. I'm going to set the margin top to 20 to separate it from the text. And of course, we want to change the text content. We want to change the title to say create new room. And for the text, you probably want to tell your users that we're making a public room. So we could say, type the name of your public room. Every user will be able to join this room. And this isn't going to be for an email. We're not going to be letting users type in their email, so we don't want to have type as email. That'll be type text, and we'll set the label to room name. And then finally, for our buttons, we'll set the cancel button to have the color error, so we make it red. And instead of subscribe for the other button, we'll make the text submit, and we'll set the color to success or green. So we'll use that in order to create the room. And we can just take a quick look and see if it appears the way that we want. This looks pretty good to me. Before we get started with the process of creating the room, we want to set up a couple of pieces of state. Again, we'll use state up at the top of our sidebar. We first want to have just a Boolean piece of state, which by default will be false. This will be is creating room, and this is what's going to control the visibility of our dialog. And the setter will be set creating room. So we'll head back to our dialog, and we want to change the hard-coded true value to is creating room. And then when we click on the icon button, we can add an on click and just write an inline function and use the setter set creating room and pass a value of true. We also need to add an on close to the dialog so it knows what to do when we click away from it. And here we're just going to take that same function call, but just pass in a value of false to hide the dialog. The same applies for our cancel button. We'll add an on click and just set creating room to false. So now we should be able to toggle the visibility of our dialog, but we still need to preserve somewhere the room name. We can do that in state. We'll use state and set its default value to an empty string, and we'll call this variable the room name, and the setter will set room name. So when a user uses the text field and we have the on change to grab the event whenever a user types into it, we can take that event and pass to set room name event.target.value. And we also want this to be a controlled component. We want its value on the value prop to be controlled by state, so we can clear out this text field whenever we submit or create a new room. So we want value to be set to room name. And here we want ID. One other fix is that I'll set the ID to room name rather than name. So now the stage is set to be able to actually create a new room. For this, we're going to have an async function create room. And here we can just console log the room name for now. And to make sure that this works, we'll add an onClick to our submit button and just pass a reference to create room. And we want to confirm that we can type in the room name, and when we hit submit, we see that text logged to the console. Before we submit a room, we want to make sure that the room name is actually there. So to check and make sure we actually have some text stored in state, we can say room name. We can use the optional chaining operator to make sure we actually have a string, dot trim. That'll trim all the white space to make sure that we actually have a truthy value. If that's the case and this conditional passes, we can then add a document to our rooms collection. Now, we took a look at the process of adding a document with the add doc function. This is going to be identical to what we see in this code snippet here. Add doc is an async function. It takes a collection. We don't need to pass it a document. It's going to auto-generate an ID for us. And the cool thing about it is, as compared to set doc, add doc is going to return that created document. We'll see why that matters in just a second. For right now, we want to import add doc from Firebase/Firestore, and we want to create a collection reference. Now, this isn't something that we've done before, but it's identical to the doc ref that we set up. So I'm going to create a rooms ref, and it's going to use the collection function from Firebase Firestore. Once again, we need to pass in a reference to the root Firestore instance. We always need to pass in DB, and then a string reference to the collection. And this is always going to be an odd number. And this, in terms of segments, is just going to be one segment. In our case, it's just going to be the segment rooms. So we have our rooms ref. We can pass this to add doc. And like set doc, it has a data object as a second argument. So we can pass in an object with all the fields that we want to add to this newly created document. We're going to have each of our room documents consist of a name, and that will be set to the room name that we have in state, as well as a server timestamp. So the timestamp field will be set to server timestamp. We'll make sure to import that and call that. And we're going to get back, if we await this function, and we need to make sure that create room is an async function to be able to use await, to await our promise here. We're going to get back the newly created document, the newly created room. So you could call this new doc or new room. And we're going to do a few things in the process of, after the process of creating this new room. We first of all want to close our dialog. We want to clear out our input field, our text field. We want to set the menu to 2 to display our rooms tab. And then we also want to navigate to that specific room according to its ID. So we want to set the query parameter room ID to the ID of the newly created room. So let's do all of that. We'll set creating room to false. We'll hide the dialog, set the room name to an empty string to remove the text from the text field. We'll set the menu to 2 to display the rooms tab. And then we will use the built-in use router hook from next/router to grab a reference to our router. And this allows us to imperatively, that is, using the function router.push, go to the specific route. And in our case, we're going to stay on the home page, but we're just going to change the query param room ID to new doc.id. And I do actually like new room better than new doc. So I'm going to change this document reference to new room instead. So with all of that, we're going to cross our fingers and save sidebar and make sure we don't have any errors. We're going to open our dialog, add a new room name. I'll name mine programming. And we should see here our dialog go away, our tab change, and we should go to our new route. And when we hit submit, we see an error because DB is not defined. That will probably happen to you a few times of not having something imported. So let's make sure everything's imported from Firebase/Firestore as well as from our Firebase file. Let's try that one more time. Hit submit, and perfect. We're taken to the new tab. We have our room ID, dialog went away, and if we check Firestore, we might need to refresh. We see a new collection, rooms, with a new document with the values that we provided. To round out this section, let's make it possible for our users to sign out by clicking this sign out button in the top right-hand corner of our sidebar. And this is going to be a very simple addition. We're going to make sure that we're in our sidebar component. We're going to head to our header area where we have our icon button with the icon exit to app. Here we just need to add an on-click, and there's really no need to even bring in a hook. There's no need to have a hook. We can just directly reference in the return of an arrow function the auth variable. Make sure that we import that from source utils Firebase, and we can just anywhere in our app call this sign out function. It'll take care of signing out the current user. So we'll make sure to call this, and you'll see that once we've saved and we attempt to sign out our user, right now we just have to make sure that we are signed in. You'll see that once we do so, we're immediately going to be taken back to our login component, and even if we refresh the page, that's all we're going to be able to see. So we are successfully signing out our user and protecting all of our chat related content. Let's begin by making sure that we're signed in to our app. The next step is going to be to create some custom hooks like we did for our use auth user hook to be able to display the appropriate data for each of these tabs. At the moment, since we are creating rooms, we want to start with a new hook, a new custom hook in our hooks folder that will be called use rooms, and will display all of the correct data instead of this dummy data that we have here from our rooms collection in our Firestore database. We'll kick this off by going to our hooks folder and making a file use rooms. We'll export default a new hook, use rooms, and now we really get to see the power of our React Firebase hooks library. If you recall, we used it for the use auth user hook, and we exclusively used it for authentication. If we scroll all the way up, if we're taking a look at the documentation here on GitHub for React Firebase hooks, you'll see that we are specifically working with just the auth part of Firebase. There are also a ton of Cloud Firestore hooks that are very, very convenient. We're really only going to need to use a couple of them, and those are use collection and use document. In the case of this hook, our use rooms hook, this is an instance where we want to use the use collection hook. That's because if we take a look at our database, rooms is a collection, and we want all of the documents in that collection to be displayed here in the rooms tab. We'll begin by importing use collection from React Firebase hooks /Firestore up at the top of use rooms. And this is going to be a custom hook that calls a hook inside of it. This is a perfectly acceptable abstraction. This is a great use of React hooks because we're making our code a lot more declarative, and we're saying instead of just using collection directly within, in this case, our sidebar component, up at the top we're just going to be able to call use rooms and get immediately back all of our rooms data that we can then pass to our sidebar list. So this is a great use case for writing a custom hook, and we're going to be writing a few of them. It's going to simplify our code a great deal and make it a lot easier to read. So we will use a collection in use rooms, and it's perfectly acceptable if we take a look at an example usage of this hook. It's perfectly acceptable to just take a collection, the collection function. Again, we have to pass a reference to our database, so we need to make sure that we import it, and to just say rooms. This is going to return, once again, an array, and this is going to consist of the destructured values, value, loading, and error. Now, we're once again not going to need these two other values, and we're not going to have this be called value. We're going to call this instead snapshot. This is going to return to us a query snapshot where we're going to be able to get from it the document data. As for right now, let's just console log our snapshot and see what it returns. And to actually have this log work, we're going to need to call our use rooms hook. So we want to call that up at the top of sidebar, and of course make sure that we import it from the appropriate place from our hooks folder. So let's save sidebar, let's head back to our app, take a look at the console, and we see what it consists of. What's going to matter for us is not all this stuff up here. We just care about this docs property, and it consists of an array of objects. What matters for us is its ID. This is the ID of the document, and on its prototype we can see a method called data. We're going to use this to get the ID of the document as well as the data, which is a function. We just need to call that, but in order to get all of the data, to transform this data, we're going to need to iterate over this docs array and create a new object with the ID and spread in all of the data. So back in use rooms, we need to transform it, and this is the case for all of the hooks that we're going to be writing. We need to say snapshot.docs.map. So we're going to get each document. We can again hover over what we're iterating over, and we can see we're in fact getting a query document snapshot. And from this, we can return an object. We're just using this extra set of parentheses to immediately return it without the return keyword. We're going to create an object for each of these elements where it has an ID property set to doc.id. So this is what we saw in the console. And we want to spread in using the object spread operator doc.data. And again, data is a method that we need to call, and it's going to retrieve all of the data on each one of our documents. And in this case, it's going to give us the name and timestamp fields. And we can call this now rooms and return it from our hook. So when we save this and now check our logs, refresh, we see that initially, because we're in a loading state, we're going to get an error, cannot read properties of undefined. Now we could check the loading state that we have here in this hook, but another method, another approach is just to simply add the optional chaining operator here on the snapshot. That's going to prevent that error from occurring. But do be aware that there's going to be a bit of a delay before we actually get the data back. So now if we console log rooms, we see we have an array of one item, that our one created room, with all the fields that we would expect. The ID, which is not listed as a field, be mindful of that. It's not listed as a field within Firestore, but it is the ID that is linking the document to the rooms collection. We can see it here as well when we have a document open in our Firebase console. So we have everything that we would expect, and now we can display that within our rooms tab. So we'll remove that log, and we can also no longer use the data reference down here, particularly for the sidebar list component with the title rooms. Instead, we're going to set that to rooms and make sure that you are returning from our hook. Remember that we're returning all of our rooms from the hook, and then we can pass it on the data prop. So now when we save the sidebar and go to the rooms tab, you'll see the actual name of the room that we created with the real data, as well as a dynamically created avatar. We're going to have custom hooks not only for the rooms tab, but for chats, users, and we're also going to see how to display our search results. But before we move away from our use rooms hook, we need to make an improvement here. If we go back to use rooms, we saw how to just use the collection function to return a query snapshot, which gives us a documents array And then we saw how to transform that to our actual rooms data. All of this works perfectly fine. However, for most any query that you write, you're going to want to transform it somewhat. Meaning, when we list our rooms here, we want them to be sorted according to when they were created. So we want to order by the timestamp field in descending order. We want the newest rooms to be placed up at the top of the list and the older ones to be placed at the bottom. This is just one manner of sorting that you could perform. You could sort, of course, according to whatever field that you had on your documents. But this means that we need to change this up a little bit. Again, this is just a reference, this is a collection reference that we've written here. But if you want to order your data, we can take a look at the documentation and see in the read data section that we can order our data specifically with the order by function. And what this requires is to use a new function called query. So in addition to the collection reference that we have, we're going to need to wrap that, or rather pass that to the query function, which again will import from Firebase/Firestore. We want to pass in our reference at the beginning of the query, but after that we can chain on a filter. And in our case, we're going to use one called order by. Order by is another function where it accepts, first of all, the field to sort by, and as we mentioned, that was going to be the timestamp. And we can provide a second argument, which is the direction, the order by direction. And that will either be in ascending or descending order. So we want it to be in descending to sort from, to show the newest rooms that are created up at the top of the list and the oldest ones at the bottom. You would just change that to ascending if you wanted it to be the opposite. So now that this has been added, let's save all of this and make sure that our query still works. We'll refresh, and we see that it does, but now we want to add a new room, and we see that the newly created room appears at the top like we would expect. If we want to change that, as I mentioned, we would change that to ascending. The next hook that we'll create will be to display the users data in this users tab. So we'll make a new hook in our hooks folder, use users. We'll export default a function, use users. And this is going to accept, unlike our other hook, the current user. This is going to be pretty easy to write because we can steal a lot of it from our use rooms hook. We can copy all of it and make sure that we import use collection as well as query, the collection function, order by, and DB. The change that we're going to make is that we're going to reference the users collection, and again make sure it's in descending order from newest to oldest. But this is going to give us a snapshot of all the documents in our users collection. However, it's going to be a bit different than our public rooms. And the reason for that is we're going to set up a private conversation between the currently logged in user and whatever user they've selected in this list. Why this is going to require a little bit of setup is because the link is going to and has to be unique for each user. So we'll see how to set that up by first creating a users array. And what we'll do is we will still take snapshot.docs, make sure to use optional chaining again. This time, instead of using map, we're going to use for each. And for each doc, we're going to want to create a slightly different ID. As I mentioned, we want to create a different ID according to what users signed in, and these must be unique. So what we can do to ensure that is by checking and seeing if the doc ID, that string, is greater than user.uid, the currently logged in user's ID, versus the user that we're iterating over. If so, we're just going to create a string, a template string, where the ID is set to doc ID and then the user.uid. And if it's false, we're going to just invert those two values, where the user UID is first and then the doc.id. This is going to ensure that all of our references are unique. And we finally want to make sure, and we're conditionally adding values to our users array because we do not want to include ourself in this list. We can't have a chat with ourself, or at least we don't need a chat app to do that. So If doc.id is not equal to user.uid, only in that case are we going to push onto that array by saying users.push and provide our ID as a key and value, and we can just collapse that just to ID using the object shorthand. And once again, we can grab the data by spreading in doc.data. And once all that's done, we can return users, save our hook here, go back to sidebar. We're going to call use users up at the top, making sure that we're passing in the user data that we're getting from props and sidebar. We're going to get back users, which is going to be an array of objects. We're going to pass that down to the users sidebar list, just like this. So when we save that, we can go to the users tab, and we probably don't see another user unless you've already signed in with 2 users. I'm going to go ahead and do that right now. And once you've done that, you'll be able to see the other user that you just signed out of, and we should be able to click on that user and eventually display a chat here to have a private conversation with them. Now, the final tab, chats, is probably a little bit less intuitive than the other 2 tabs that we created. So what is chats exactly? Well, whenever the current user participates in a room and adds a message, or chats with a user and adds a message, we're going to write some code that will update a chats collection. And this is going to be linked to the current user, very similarly to in our use auth user hook, where we were setting a document according to the user's UID. This is going to be a sub-collection of users/user.uid/chats. So we're going to create a sub-collection chats that we're then going to query and display all of the chats that our user has participated in. This is going to be almost identical to the other 2 hooks that we just wrote. I would grab the code from use rooms and create a new file in hooks called use chats. You can paste in all that code, just make sure to change the name of the hook to use chats. And this collection is going to be users/user.uid/chats. And again, we're going to pass the user data into this hook. And that's really all we need to do at the moment. So let's save this. And one other improvement we can make is, instead of this being rooms, we're gonna call the variable that we're returning chats. So now we can call up at the top of sidebar use chats. Make sure to pass the user data into that hook, and we're going to get back the chats data. And this data, this array, is going to be passed down to the data prop on the first sidebar list component. Now, we don't have anything there currently. As I mentioned, once we add the ability to add messages, we're going to populate this collection, and it's going to make a lot more sense how this is being used. And now the final component to add for our sidebar, to have a complete, fully functional sidebar, is the search function, to be able to search for users or rooms and then display those search results here, once again using the sidebar list component. Now let's make it possible to search for users or rooms based off of the query that's typed in to the search form here up at the top of our sidebar. Now, this is going to be a little bit different than writing just a simple hook. We're going to need to take the text that was written into the input and then perform our query and display the results in a 4th tab. We're also going to need to perform a different type of query, or rather apply a different kind of filter to the query that we're performing. Previously, we were using just the order by filter when we were writing a query on a collection. Now we want to write it on a couple of collections. We want to add a filter where it allows us to narrow down documents that match a certain text value. And we can write that with the help of the where function. Where can be combined with order by and limit. So once again, you can add as many arguments as you like to query In our case, we're just going to use where, the function where, to take a field on our document and use a comparison operator. In our case, it's going to be the equals operator, and say that that field has a value that's equal to the search query that was typed into the form. And we're going to be performing a couple of queries because we're not only going to be querying the users collection, as we see in our search, in our placeholder, we're searching for users or rooms. So we're going to see how to perform that search on two collections at the same time. We're going to begin by storing all of the search results in state so that they can then be displayed in our sidebar. So heading back to the sidebar component, we're going to get rid of our dummy data now since we no longer need it. And we're going to use state, and this time we're just going to pass in an empty array, and our state variable will be search results and set search results. Remember that we have a sidebar list where menus equal to 4, and that's going to be for our search results. So we want to pass the search results data, that search results array, down to the data prop. There's nothing in it currently, but the way that we're going to populate it, to add data to it, to set data in state, I should say, is with a function that will be called when our form is submitted, specifically our search form. So go to our form element, and we want to add an onSubmit and pass a reference to a new function which we'll call search users and rooms. Now this function, which we'll create above the return, will be async, and it's going to receive an event when our form's submitted. We want to call event.preventDefault to make sure our page isn't reloaded, and to grab the value of our input. Because we're using a form and the ID of our input is search, and we've set an ID here, we can say event.target, which is the form element, .elements, meaning the children of that form, .search, because we have an input with the ID of search, .value, and that will allow us to get the search value or the search query. I'm going to call this search value, and we're going to use that in the two queries that we write. The first query is going to be the user query. So we know how to write a query according to all the hooks that we've written. It's going to start with the query function, and we need a reference to the collection. So we'll use the collection function, pass in our database, and a reference to the user's collection in this case. And now we're going to use the where function, so we'll import that. We want to look for the document's where name, and then the second argument will be the comparison operator, which will be a double equals is equal to the search value. And we can make an identical query for the room query. The only thing we have to change here is that this is going to be on the rooms collection. But we haven't taken a look at how to actually get documents without using a custom hook. So without using something like use collection, what would we use? Well, fortunately, in addition to the getDoc function, there's also a getDocs function from Firebase that receives a query and is perfect for this particular use case. We just need to call await getDocs, make sure to import it, user query, and it will return a user snapshot. We'll copy that and create another call to getDocs, but this time passing in the room query, and we'll get back a room snapshot. And we know that we need to transform these documents from the snapshot to something that can actually be displayed. We can take this from use users, where we were iterating over snapshot.docs, but this time for our user snapshot, we're going to use map, and we're just going to, instead of adding that conditional, just return an object with the ID and then the spread in doc.data. We'll replace snapshot with just user snapshot, and this will be our user results. And for the room snapshot, we'll grab use rooms, where we are just using map to transform the docs, this time from room snapshot, and we're going to get back our room results. And now all of our search results can be put in a variable where we can create a new array and spread in first the user results and then the room results. So we have one big array of results. If this happens to return both rooms and users, we can set the menu to 4 to display them, and finally put the new search results in state with the set search results function. So now let's save everything, make sure that we're not getting any errors, and if we take a look at one of our users, we can search for their name, and when we hit enter, we now are no longer on the users tab, we're on the search results tab, and we see our one result. And if we take a look at the rooms, we can search for either one of the rooms. When we hit enter, we just see that one result. So now, in addition to displaying all of the rooms, all of the users, we can search for an individual one or a subset of them. Now we're going to move on to the fun part of our app, which is actually creating and displaying messages in our main chat area. But before we do that, there's one small improvement that we can make to our search results component. So when we're fetching search results, we might not have any returned to us, and at the moment we just see nothing. This is a problem. It's good to tell our users when there's no content. So we can improve this by heading to our sidebar list component, and we can add another conditional after we're checking to see if there's no data. Here we can say if not data.length, so if there are no results and the title is equal to the text search results, then we can return a div with the class no result, no dash result. This will have a child of just a div with no class. That will contain a search outlined icon. Then as a sibling, a div with the class cancel dash root with a cancel outlined icon. And then underneath these two divs and still within the no result div, we're going to have an h2 that says no, and then interpolate our title, meaning no search results. So when we save that, we can now tell our user, hey, there are no search results for your particular query. The first step to our chat component is actually being able to fetch the room that we've created and have in our database. So we have a couple of rooms at this point. We want to see how to grab the ID, the room ID from the current URL, and then query our database to display that chat, which will ultimately contain all of the messages that have been posted in it. To begin, we're going to make a chat component, so a file chat.js within the components folder. We'll export default function chat, and chat is going to need to receive the user data. So we'll destructure user from props before we even pass it. And now that we've written the name of our component, we can go to our home page. We can go back to index.js, and we're going to insert the chat right next to our sidebar and pass the user data from useauth user down to the chat component. We'll save index and head back to chat. We're just going to return a div, a dummy div with whatever we like for now. We're just focused on fetching the data, and we don't need to pass it as props. We can get it from the use router hook by bringing in use router from next/router, get a reference to the router, and we specifically want the room ID. That's going to come from router and a property called query, which is an object. And because there's a room ID property on it, or rather a room ID query param, there should be a room ID property on the query object. Now, this might be undefined. If that's the case, then we want to provide a fallback value, and we can use the special question mark or the nullish coalescing operator, which is a mouthful, but it just means that if this value evaluates to undefined or null, then it's going to go to the right-hand side of this expression and just give us whatever we've provided. So in our case, we just want it to be an empty string. We're just writing this to make sure that we actually have a string value, either the room ID or just an empty string. And we're also going to create a reference to the user ID. We're doing this because we're going to be using this quite a bit in our chat component, and that's going to be set to user.uid, as we already know. Now, the main thing that we want to accomplish at this point is to fetch the room data. Again, we'll make a dedicated hook to simplify our code. We'll call this useRoom. We'll make sure to give it the same name in the file that we create, and we want to call it in chat, and we're going to pass in, we'll make sure to import it, and then pass in both the room ID and the user ID, both of those variables that we just created, and we should get back a room. Now let's make sure to provide those two parameters, and they should be in the order room ID and then user ID. And we're going to figure out how we're going to fetch the correct data, regardless of whether this is a private chat with another user or a public chat. How are we going to do that based off of the room ID and the user ID? We need to check and see if we're in a user room, and we'll see why in just a second. We're going to create a variable is user room, and we can detect that it's a user's room by checking if the room ID includes, since this is a string, we can use the includes method, if it includes the user ID. This matters because we need to fetch data according to a different collection and ultimately a different document ID based off of if we're in a private room, it'll be the user's collection, and if it's a public room, it'll be the room's collection. So we need to get both of those values in order to perform our query. We're going to need the collection ID first. So is it going to be users or room? Well, if it is a user room, we know that it should be the user's collection, otherwise the room's collection. And as for the doc ID, the document ID, if it's a user room, we need to take the room ID and use the replace string method. You need to replace the user ID just with an empty string. Otherwise, we're just going to use the room ID as is. We need to replace the user ID to then be able to fetch the correct document off of the user's collection. And now we're not fetching a collection, so we can't use from React Firebase hooks the use collection hook. We're going to use the other hook that I mentioned, the use document hook. This has an identical syntax. We can import it from React Firebase hooks. It needs a document reference, so we're going to use the doc function. We need to pass in the DB, and as the second argument, we're going to pass a string, which is going to be a reference to the collection ID / the document ID. We only want to perform this query if we actually have a document ID. In the event that we don't, we can add a conditional. What's neat about this hook is that if we pass in the value of null, this won't be executed and we won't get an error. So we can just say if we have a document ID, we can write a ternary and say, use that document reference, otherwise use a reference of null. And we're going to get back, just like we did for use collection, a snapshot within an array. If we don't have a snapshot, if not snapshot.exists, we again need to use the optional chaining operator. If that doesn't exist, we want to return null. But if it does exist, if it returns a value of true, we want to return the ID. We want to return an object rather with an ID field set to snapshot.id. We want to use a photo URL, and this is going to come from either snapshot.photo URL or our fallback of a dice bearer avatar. So again, avatars.dicebearer.com/API/jdenticon/ and then snapshot id.svg, and then finally spread in snapshot.data. That was a lot, but now let's see it and make sure this works. We can save use room and head back to chat, and we're just going to console log the room that we're hopefully getting back. We'll save chat and make sure that we navigate to an actually valid page with a valid room ID. And if we're on a public room, we see the appropriate data being returned. And if it's a private chat, we see the URL change, and we see that particular user's data, their ID, and their name. Now that we're fetching the room data and we have something to display within the chat component, let's build the basic structure of our chat component. We're going to start with a header, which again will have the avatar or image of our room, the title, a few buttons to add an image, as well as to delete, a menu that will allow us to ultimately delete a room, the main messages area, as well as a footer. We're just going to start with the first half of this. We're not going to build the messages or the footer just yet. We're just going to add the basic structure of the header and the background. So let's go into the chat component if you're not already. We want to first add a conditional and say if we don't have a room, then we want to return null. But if we do have one, let's return a div with the class chat. Within that div, we'll have another one with the class chat background, and this can be a self-closing tag. It'll display our pattern background here that was on our home page as well. And beneath that, we'll have our chat header. So we'll have a div with the class chat header that will contain a div with the class avatar container, and this will consist of an avatar material component with the source set to room.photo URL and some alt text of room.name. After this div, we'll have another one with the class chat header info. That'll consist of an h3 as a child, where we'll again display the room name. We will display it up at the top on the left-hand side. After this div, we'll have the right-hand side of our chat header. So this will be a div, the class chat header right. That'll consist of an input with an ID of image. We want to hide it, so we'll set its style and set display to none. We want it to only accept images, so we can add the accept attribute and set it to image/*, meaning accept any image file of any extension. We want it to be of type file, and underneath this input, we're going to have an icon button, which our user is going to actually click and trigger this input. So this icon button will have a label element within it, and that label is going to have an icon of add photo alternate inside of it. The label will have the style cursor, pointer, and height 24, as well as an HTML4 set to image to make sure that this button actually triggers this hidden input. So if we save, we should be able to see that image button here and be able to click it and then select an image. We don't need to use that just yet, obviously. After the icon button, we'll have a menu from material where the ID will be set to menu, and it'll also have a prop called keep mounted. We'll complete this in a future section when we actually make it possible to delete a room. It's going to consist of a menu item component also from material, and it's going to have the text delete room. Now this menu is not going to be visible. We once again need another icon button. We'll add it after the first icon button, and we want to give it an icon of more vert as a child. So now we see a button that we can click, but it's not displaying our menu. We'll see how to, again, make that possible in a future lesson. But for now, we've got the basic elements of our chat component. We've got a header and we've got an area that we can display our messages in. As we saw in the deployed version of our app, whenever we select an image, we want to make it possible to display a preview of that image. So we're going to need to have a dedicated media preview, and we want to be able to toggle it. We want to be able to close it if we're not interested in uploading it. This process is going to be pretty simple. We're going to add a couple of pieces of state within our chat component. Our first one, and make sure to bring in use state, our first one will have a default value of null, and it's going to be the image file, and the setter will be set image. The next one, piece of state, will be set to an empty string by default, and we're going to call it source, and setter set source. What's going to happen is when we select our button here, when we click our button, we want it to call a function that will show a preview. So let's head to our hidden input. We want to add an on change. This is going to be called when the button's clicked. We'll call a function show preview. We'll add this above our conditional. This will be a plain function where we want to get the event data because this is going to give us the file, specifically from event.target.files, and we want to get the 0th element off of this files property. It's going to give us the file that we chose, and we can write a conditional where we say if we have a file, we want to put it in state with set image. And we can also use the file reader API by saying new file reader. We're going to get back a reference to that reader, and we can say reader.read as data URL, pass in the file, and then use the onLoad function, which you can write like this. This is a callback where once the file's loaded, we can call set source and pass in reader.result. We can test that and make sure that it works by console logging the image and the source instead of the room for now. We'll select an image, select open, and we see a bunch logged to our console. We first see a file, and then we see the image preview written as this base 64 string. And now that we have this source data, this base 64 string, we can pass that to a new component to actually display the preview. That's the significance of this source state. And we want to put this media preview underneath all of the elements that we've written. So we're going to create a reference to a component we haven't created. We're going to call it media preview. We want to pass through the source, and we also want to pass down a callback close preview. First, we're going to create that new component in our components folder, media preview.js. We'll export default function media preview, and this is going to be a fairly simple component. We'll destructure source and close preview from props. If we don't have a source, we don't want to return anything. So if no source, return null. But if we have source data, we want to return a div, the class media preview, written in camel case like this. We also want a close rounded icon. And if we click on this, we'll add an on click. We want to close the preview. That's our little X icon in the top right hand corner. And underneath that, we're going to have an image where the source is set to source and the alt text is set to preview. So if we save that, we can head back to chat, and we need to create our close preview function. And this is going to be really simple. To close it, we just need to set source to an empty string, which we know will hide our media preview, so we won't see that anymore. And we also want to set image to null. So let's save everything and make sure that we import media preview. That was the one thing I forgot to do. We'll import media preview from source components media preview. We're getting this warning from our menu component. Let's just set open to false to hide that if that bothers you. We can also remove the console log. We don't need that in chat anymore. Let's select an image. When we choose an image, hit open. We have our preview. We have our button, our icon here to close it, and we don't have the ability to upload it just yet. We'll see how to using the image state in just a little bit. But for now, we can close our preview and it disappears immediately. We finished a big portion of our chat component. One major part of it left to create is the footer here. Let's create a dedicated chat footer component in our components folder. So we'll create that file and export default chat footer component. We'll begin by returning a div with the class chat footer. It'll first consist of a form with an input element. This will have the placeholder text, type a message like you see here. And we're also going to display some additional content, or we're going to going to display content conditionally based off of whether we're recording or not. So we're going to have a dummy variable we set to a Boolean value. This will be called can record. We're going to set it to true. And underneath our input, but still within our form, we're going to have a ternary where if can record is true, we'll have a button that's of type submit, and the class name send btn. And in this button, we're going to insert a variable called record icons. We'll create this variable above our return, and this is going to be a fragment that consists of two side-by-side icons. The first one is the send icon, where we'll set the width of this icon to 20, height to 20, and color white. And we'll create another icon, mic rounded, with width 24, height 24, and also color white. If we can't record, we'll return a fragment with a label, which will also contain these record icons. The label will have an HTML4 of capture, and the class name send btn as well. And underneath this label, we'll have an input, another hidden input. So we'll set the inline style display to none. This will be of type file, ID, capture to match the label. It'll accept audio, so it'll be of type audio/star. We want to add the capture attribute, and if we save, let's add our chat footer at the very bottom of our chat to just see what it looks like so far. We'll add it underneath our media preview, and it's looking good so far. The last thing that we'll add is some additional content if we're recording. You can see that our microphone icon and button moves out of the way to now display, as we're recording, a delete or X icon and a check mark icon. And we also see the time being displayed in the middle with this blinking red dot. So back in chat footer, underneath our form, we want to add a conditional where if is recording is true, and we'll again add another dummy variable, is recording, set to true. We want to add some additional JSX. We'll add a div with the class record, and in that div, we'll have a cancel rounded icon, and we'll set the style of it. We'll set the width to 30, height to 30, and color to this red color, which is the hex F20519. After this icon, we'll have a div, and in this div, another one with the class record red circle. After that, a div with an opening and closing tag with the class record duration. This is where we'll output the time that's elapsed. And then after this div, but still within the record div, we'll have a check circle rounded icon where again the width will be 30, height 30, but this time the color will have the hex 41BF49. And when we save that, because is recording is true, we now see the extra content that we added, but our button hasn't moved out of the way. So to fix that, we'll go up to our input, and we want to add an inline style there as well and say the width should change according to the value of is recording. If that's true, we want to say, using the calc function, we want to take 100% of the width and then subtract 20 pixels. Otherwise, we'll say calc 100% minus 112 pixels. And if we save that, we now see our button go away, and these two buttons in our duration pop into view. If we were to change the value of is recording back to false, we would see our input changes, that all of that content goes away, and we now see our record button again. Now that we've added the ability to preview an image and we've added our chat footer here, let's piece everything together so that we can actually send a message. Remember that we're storing our image state back in the parent component, the parent to chat footer, which is chat. We're not doing anything with the image. We also need to get, whenever we send a message, we not only need to get the image, but we also need to get the value that's typed into the input. So since we have the image state stored up here, we're in a position to send our message within the main chat component. But how do we get the text state? How do we get what's typed into the input and pass it up to chat so that we can send off of our message? Well, we can simply lift state up, meaning we can create some state to store the chat message, and we're going to call this input, and the setter set input, and we're going to make it possible to update this state by passing down both values, the setter and the state value itself, to our component, our chat footer component. So we want to pass down input. We also want to pass down an onChange for that input, where this function will get the event that's typed in, from the onChange event, because this will be passed down to our inputs onChange. It's going to get the event and then take event.target.value to set the state here in our chat component. We'll also pass down to chat footer the image, as well as the user data, the room, and the room ID. Let's go ahead and go into the chat footer and add, or rather destructure, all of those values from props, input, onChange, image, user, room, and room ID. And we'll save that. We'll start by going down to our input and making it a controlled input. We'll set the value prop to the value of input. And as we mentioned, we'll connect the onChange of the input to the onChange callback. So now we can successfully update state in our parent component. This is the lifting state up pattern, and then passing the callback down that in turn updates the state in that parent component. And we're going to make it possible to send our message within our chat footer. But first we need to know whether we can send a message. We'll create a variable can send message, and we're going to take the input, the text, and trim it if there's a message, or if the input is an empty string but we have an image, we can send a message. So we can send just text, or if we don't have any text but we have an image, we're going to be able to send the message. If we want to send a message and it needs to be performed within the chat function, we want to pass that down as well. So we'll make an async function because we're going to talk to our Firebase backend. This will be send message. And for right now, we just want to pass this down as a prop as well to chat footer. So we'll add that prop to chat footer and destructure that value from props so that in our button, this button here, where if can record is true, this is specifically for sending a text or image message. The other is for sending an audio message, which we'll get to in the next section. We want to add an onClick, where if can send message is true, we want to call the send message function. Otherwise, we want to call the start recording function, which we don't have yet. So we're just going to write an arrow function which returns null. So just to correct myself, this same button is going to be used for recording an audio message as well as sending a text or image message. It's just that this here is going to be for capturing the audio input, meaning what we record through our microphone. So heading back to our chat component, let's actually make it possible to send a message. We want to take the event and call event.preventDefault once again. When we send a message, we want to clear the input, so we'll set input to an empty string. If we have an image, we want to close the preview, and to generate a unique image name, we're going to use a package which we'll install called nanoid. So in our terminal, we'll install with npm i nanoid. We can call this, we can import it from the nanoid package and call it and put it in a variable image name. Now we're going to create a new message, a new chat message, and this is either going to include just text data or text and image data. So our message is going to consist of a name from the current user, and that's going to be from user.displayname, the message, which is going to be the input text, the UID, the current user's UID, the timestamp, which will be the server timestamp as well, and a time. This will be used to display the time that a given message was posted, as you can see right here. We're just going to use the date constructor and the toUtc method, toUtc string method, in order to generate a date string. And then we're going to conditionally add image data by spreading in within a set of parentheses a conditional where if we have an image, we're going to add the properties to this object image URL set to uploading, because we don't have the image URL just yet. We'll see how to upload it to Firebase storage in just a second. And we're also going to include the image name. Otherwise, if we don't have an image in state, we're just going to spread in an empty object and therefore add no properties here. We're going to add our first chat because we're posting within this particular room and it's therefore going to be displayed in the chats area. We'll say await set doc, and we want to reference a document with the doc function, making sure to pass in the DB with the reference users/user ID /chats/room ID. And it's going to include the data name set to room.name. So all the data that we need to display it in that tab, as well as the photo URL, which will be room.photo URL or null, and a server timestamp. And we're also going to add a document. This is going to be to a collection. As we know, add doc works only with collections. So we'll bring in the collection function, pass in DB, and then this is going to be on the rooms collection, rooms/room ID/messages. So we're going to finally add a message to this messages sub-collection. It'll be created if one doesn't exist, and we want to pass in an object, namely our new message that we created here. You could certainly also include it directly just by copying this entire object, not creating a dedicated variable, and then providing it like this. It's entirely up to you. And before we attempt to post this message, we want to add to Firebase or Firebase storage. So we'll make sure on the left-hand side that we go to build and then storage. And we want to get started with storage. And again, we're going to start in test mode. We'll select done to create our cloud storage in our cloud storage location. And once we have our storage created, we can really just think of our storage as being just a number of different folders with individual files in them. If we go to the documentation and take a look at the storage section and go to web, once again, we're going to need to create a reference. So this is pretty identical to working with Firestore. We're going to need to create a reference with storage, but using the ref function from Firebase/storage. And the folder is kind of like, you can kind of think of it like a collection. Our folder is going to be called images. And whenever we create an image, it's going to be / and then the name of that image. To upload an image, we can use the upload bytes function, which just takes the storage ref and then a file. And if we want to get information about the uploaded file, and that's namely going to be the file URL, we can use the get download URL function from Firebase storage. And that's what we're going to use to update the value that we previously had as uploading. But the last piece of the puzzle before we start uploading our file to Firebase storage is we want to compress our image. We don't want to just trust that the user has given us a really small image. We want to compress it ourselves on the client. For that, we can open our terminal and install a package called compressor.js, and we're going to use version 1.2.1 of that package. Up at the top, we'll import compressor from compressor.js. And then at the bottom of send message, we'll first make sure that we have a new document from add doc and check to see if we have an image in state. If we do, then we're going to call new compressor. Compressor takes a file, which is going to be our image, and then we can include an options array where we can set the quality, and we might want to set it to 80% or 0.8, the max width that we'll accept, and maybe that'll be 1920. This is totally up to you what you want to choose for your images. You might want to pick something smaller to reduce the size, and because of course there's an associated cost with Firebase storage. And then we're going to include a callback function, which is going to be an async function, a method called success, where we're going to get the result, which is the compressed file according to the specifications we provided. Here is where, when we get our file, we want to set source to an empty string, set our image back to its initial state of null, and we want to upload our file with upload bytes. We'll make sure to import that from Firebase storage. We'll await that, create a reference using the ref function, which will again import storage, and we're going to have a reference to images, new folder / image name, which is the unique ID, and then finally pass the result, the compressed image, as the file to upload. And when that's done, we can await get download URL, where again we'll create a reference with storage and the image name. We're going to get back a URL and then use a new Firebase Firestore function to update data. If we take a look at the docs, this is the update doc function, and this takes a reference as well as the data as a second argument. So something, a signature that we're familiar with. So at the end, we can just await update doc, import that, and we need to create a document reference. Keep in mind, this is a document reference that we need to pass, and we'll pass in DB, and our full ref, our full string will be /rooms, room ID, /messages, and we need to reference the new doc.id, and we'll pass the field image URL set to the image URL that we got back from the get download URL function. With all of that, we can save all of our files, and we'll attempt, after a refresh, let's make sure that we don't have any errors. Let's try adding a message and hitting enter. We see the chats tab was updated, so it looks like this was performed successfully. We can only really be sure by checking our Firestore database. If we take a look at the room that we updated, this is a private chat room. So if we go to that, we can see it has a messages sub-collection linked to a document, and that looks like it includes all of the information that we provided on that new message variable that we included right here when we called add doc to room /room ID /messages. And now let's attempt to add a message with an image. So we'll just add some message along with this image. We'll hit enter. And once again, we don't see anything, but if we head back to Firestore, we see another message, and we see a couple more fields, one for the image name, this random ID, as well as the image URL. And because we have that, it's an indication that this was successfully saved to our images folder. And if we click on the name of this, we can see that we do in fact have. However, I made one small error. Instead of including the result within the ref function, this is actually in the upload bytes function. This is my mistake. If we save that, if we make that change and save that, we can go ahead and, by the way, delete any file that we like in here. So that's an invalid file since it wasn't uploaded properly. If we go back to Firestore, we can go to the messages collection and delete that particular document. So let's try that again. We'll select the same image, add some message, hit enter, and if we check Firebase storage now, we see if we click on it a little image preview which indicates that it was in fact uploaded properly. Now that we're actually able to create chat messages, whether they include text content or image content, let's see how we can display them within our application. But before we do that, we need to fetch them. And for that, we're once again going to use a dedicated hook in the hooks folder called use chat messages. You'll export default function use chat messages. This will accept a room ID, and we're fetching an entire collection that is the messages collection, so we'll use the use collection hook. We only want to fetch this if we actually have a room ID, so we'll once again include a ternary when calling this hook. We want to assemble a query, and this is going to consist of a collection where we'll pass in DB, and the ref will be to rooms, and then insert the room ID / messages. And also within query, after the first argument, we'll use an order by, and again, order according to the timestamp field, but in this case in ascending order. And if we don't have a room ID, of course we want to pass in null. We're going to get back a snapshot from use collection, and we're going to say snapshot.docs.map, where for each doc, we're going to return an object and grab the doc ID and set it to the ID field, the ID property, and we're going to spread in doc.data. We'll put all this in a messages variable and return that from this hook. So now we can use chat messages within the chat component, use chat messages and pass in the room ID. We're going to get back messages, and these messages need to be displayed above our media preview component. So we're going to start with a div. This will have a class chat body container. Within that div will be another one with the class chat body, and in that a new component called chat messages. We're going to pass messages as well as user, room ID, all of these props down to the chat messages component, which we need to create now. Chat messages.js, export default function, chat messages. We'll destructure messages, user, and room ID in the props object. If we don't have any messages, we want to return null in this component. But if we have messages, we want to return messages.map, where for each message, let's return a set of curly braces so that we can create a isSender variable. And we're going to be the sender if the message.uid, remember that we're saving the UID field whenever we're adding a new message of the current user. This enables us to say we're the sender if message.uid is equal to the current user or user.uid, so that then we can return a div with the class, and we're going to write this using a template string, chat message, and then we'll interpolate a ternary where we say if we're the sender, we're going to apply the class chat message sender, otherwise an empty string. So we're going to apply a different class to our messages. We're going to flip the side of the screen that they're on according to whether isSender is true. That's what that class does. We're also going to create a span with the class chat name, where we'll insert the name from message.name to see who sent that. If the message.image URL is uploading, remember that uploading was just a string, just a static string here at the beginning. The reason for that is so we could add a quick check and say, if that was the case, then we'll add a div that will display a circular progress. So we'll have a div with the class image-container that'll have a child div with the class image container -- loader. This will contain a circular progress where we'll set the width of it to 40 and the height to 40 if the image URL is set to the string uploading. But if we have an actual image URL, then we're going to return a div with the class image container, image-container, but with the image itself, where the source is set to message.imageURL and the alt set to message.name. And finally, if it doesn't meet either of those, we're just going to return, a null value. We'll return nothing. And then finally, we're going to have, if we have a message with audio data, we're going to have a property message.audio name. We're going to get to this in the next section. Otherwise, we're going to have a span with the message itself, where that's going to be set to message.message. And in the true case, if message.audio name, if we have a field and this evaluates to true, we're going to return an audio player. For right now, we don't need to include that. We're just going to return a div, but just to show you what's ahead. And in this span where we display our message, we're going to have the class chat message -- message, and underneath that we'll include the time. So we'll have a span of the class chat timestamp, where we'll insert the time from message.time, which is that UTC string that we added. So let's save chat messages. We'll make sure that we import that into our chat component. We'll save everything. And now, as long as we just fix this warning, this key warning within chat messages, where we need to set the key to message.id, we now have our messages being displayed with the author, the message content, the date and time that it was sent. You can, of course, format this to your liking. We have an image, if an image has been uploaded with the message, and we see the message content there as well. And we see it all on the right-hand side of the screen in green because we sent it. Now we're going to make it possible to have our users record an audio message. They'll be able to click this button in the bottom right-hand corner, and right now it doesn't really do anything. They're going to be able to click this button. They'll be prompted to start recording. They can either block or allow that ability. If they allow it, then they'll immediately be recording audio. We'll take that audio, and when they're done, when they hit the check mark, we'll upload that audio file to Firebase storage just like we did the image file. We're going to start in our chat footer. So let's head to the chat footer component, and we need to change this hard-coded can record value. This is actually going to be determined based off of a value on the window. On the window we have this navigator object, and on navigator we have a property called mediadevices.getUserMedia. We're going to need this function in order to record audio, and we're also going to need from the window, we can explicitly say window if we want, window dot in capital letters with a capital M, window dot media recorder. If they can record and we don't want this to evaluate to a function, we want this to evaluate to a Boolean, so we can just say, we can just add the double not operator or the Boolean function to make sure that this resolves to a Boolean. If we have both of those values on the window, we can record the user's audio. To start recording their audio, they're going to need to click the button in the bottom right-hand corner. To do that, we'll replace this dummy function with the start, with a reference to the start recording function, which we haven't created yet. To start recording, we're going to create an async function, start recording, that's going to receive an event. We want to prevent default once again, so we don't have that page reload like we just did. We want to await a new function called record audio, and this is from the record audio file that we imported at the beginning of our project. We're bringing this in, and we want to create a reference to it that can be used both in start recording and in other functions. So we're going to use a ref. We're going to use the useRef hook, and we're just going to call that, and we're going to create a variable called record. So if we set record.current equal to the result of record audio, if we dig into that function, you'll see that we have the ability to start and stop the recording. This is, of course, when our promise has resolved here. So now, using record, we can say record.current.start, not play, start or stop. That's going to do the work of actually recording the audio that we need for our audio file. All we're going to do in start recording is we're going to set recording to true. So we're going to have, instead of this hard-coded isRecording variable will have a piece of state with useState. We'll bring that in. We'll set it by default to false, and we'll create an isRecording variable with the setter setRecording. We'll call setRecording. We'll pass in the value of true, and we also, in our parent component in chat, so we'll go back to chat, we want to create another piece of state that will be passed down to our chat footer, and this is going to be an audio ID. So we'll initialize a new piece of state to an empty string. This will be audio ID, setter, set audio ID. Both of those are going to be passed down to chat messages. We'll go ahead and pass it down there. We'll see how those are used later. And for our chat footer component, we're just going to pass down the set audio ID function. So within chat footer, we're going to grab set audio ID so that within start recording, we can set that to an empty string, to its initial value. So we're passing our two functions to record this record ref, but we're not actually using it. We're not having our browser record any audio. We're going to do that with the help of a useEffect hook, and we're going to listen and have our effect function run if isRecording, if that value changes. If isRecording is true, we want to use that ref specifically from the current property and say start. We want to call the start function. And at the moment, that's all we're going to do right now. We just want to save chat footer and chat, and I passed the wrong value to both chat messages and chat footer. Now when we click on this button, we're going to be prompted to use our microphone. We're going to allow it, and we see our two buttons here to cancel the recording or to accept it. We don't see the duration changing. We're going to get to that in the next step. But we do see, if you take a look at the tab here, you see this little red dot. It's an indication that we are recording audio currently. It's using our camera or microphone, as you see in the description below. So we can stop this if we refresh the page, but for the time being, we're able to start the recording, and we're going to see in the next few steps how to change the elapsed time when we start recording, how to grab all the audio data, pass it to Firebase storage, and create an audio file, as well as stop the recording. When we're recording these audio files, we want to update the elapsed time here. At the moment, we just see the value 0. We want that to increment a second at a time. To do that, we'll head back to our useEffect, where we're using useEffect within chat footer. We're just starting our recording. Additionally, we're going to call a function start timer. This function doesn't exist, but we're going to create it locally within our effect function. We'll create a function named start timer, and this is just plain JavaScript that we're going to be working with. We're going to create a start variable set to date.now, and we want to set an interval. It's going to call a function every 100 milliseconds, every tenth of a second, and then update a duration in state. So we need to create a couple of things. We want to create another ref, and this is going to be set to timer interval, and we're going to create a piece of state to hold on to our formatted time. So by default, it'll be 00:00, 0 seconds and 0 minutes, and we're going to call this duration and set duration. At the beginning of start timer, we're going to set timer interval.current to set interval, where set interval will receive a callback to be called after a certain amount of time. As we mentioned, it'll be a tenth of a second or 100 milliseconds, and this function is going to be called set time. We're going to create that within start timer. So the function will be set time, and this will be called every 100 milliseconds. We're going to store this reference to set interval within timer interval so that we can clear our interval within another function. We want to clear it obviously when we've stopped recording, so we'll do that in the stop recording function when we get to that point. Our source of truth is going to be date.now. We are just going to compare this start value with date.now whenever set time is called. So we're going to say date.now minus start, and this is going to give us our time elapsed. Now, to get total seconds, we're going to do some math here. To get the total seconds it's elapsed, we're going to say math.floor and take time elapsed divided by 1000. Using total seconds, we can get minutes and seconds. We'll create two variables, and we're going to use a special function. We're going to create one more helper function here, and this is going to be called pad. It'll accept a number value, or it could be a number or a string value, and we want to return a formatted string. We're going to take that value, convert it to a string, and if the length of it is less than 2, we want to pad it. We want to add a 0 to the beginning of value. So if we have 3 at the beginning, we would add a 0 before it, otherwise just the value itself. This is going to be helpful in creating minutes and seconds in this format to make sure that we always have 2 digits for each. So we're going to pad the result of parse int total seconds divided by 60. And for seconds, that'll be parse int total seconds, and we'll use the modulus operator to get the remainder. And that will give us a duration where using a template string, we'll insert minutes and then seconds after a colon. That is what's going to be our duration, and we'll put in state. Finally, and most importantly, now that we have this formatted time elapsed in state, we want to replace the dummy value that we have here with what's in our state variable. So now let's save our chat footer, and if we start recording, we can see that the time goes up 1 second, 2 seconds, 3 seconds. And in the next step, we're going to see how to make these two buttons work to cancel the recording or to accept it and upload it. If we're recording some audio, but we're not happy with it, we want to be able to cancel it by clicking our cancel rounded icon here, instead of reloading the page like we've been doing. We're going to create within chat footer a function underneath start recording. This will be called stop recording. It doesn't need to be async. What we will do first of all within this function is to clear our interval using the clear interval function. To that, we need to pass the reference, the ID of the interval that we created within start timer. So we can grab timer interval.current and pass it to the clear interval function to clear it and make sure that we're not counting up when we've stopped recording a given audio file. We want to set recording to false. We want to stop the browser from recording our user by saying record.current.stop, and then we need to set the duration to its initial value of 00:00. And once we have this function, we'll pass a reference to an on-click, which will add to cancel rounded. And once we have that, we can save chat footer and attempt to stop our recording. We've started it. If we click on this icon, it's stopped. Our footer goes back to normal, and we no longer see the record button up at the top. To finally upload our audio file after we've recorded it in our browser, we want to make it possible to click on the button here, the check button, and create a new audio file and ultimately create a new message as well. For that, we're going to make a new function underneath stop recording. This will be an async function called finish recording. We want to await stop recording, and this is because stop actually returns a promise. So we need to make stop recording async and await the stop function. We're going to get back audio, and we can return audio from the end of this function. And then finish recording, we want to first stop the recording. We'll get back the audio, and then we want to await the audio, just like this, to get the audio file and audio name, which will immediately destructure. So before we attempt to add that to our database and upload it to Firebase storage, let's just console log audio file and audio name to make sure that that works properly. To test this function, we'll connect finish recording to the check circle rounded icon. Again, we'll connect it with an on click. So we record, we click plus, our recording stops, and we get the file and the name. So all of that's working properly. The next step is to send the audio off to Firebase. So we'll create a new function, send audio, which we'll call at the end of finish recording. This will be an async function which will receive an audio file and audio name. We'll begin by awaiting set doc. We'll pass in a doc reference, pass in DB, and the reference will be to the users collection, users/user.uid/chats/room ID to update our chats tab. We'll update it with the name of the room from room.name. Again, we need to make sure that we're receiving this from props. So just confirm that that's the case. The photo URL will be room.photoURL or null. And the timestamp will be a server timestamp. We want to add a new doc. We'll await add doc. And the collection that we'll use will be rooms/room ID/messages. So we're going to add a new message. This is just an audio message. And the data that we're going to add there is the name of our current user, their display name, their UID from user.uid, timestamp again from server timestamp, the time set to a UTC string by getting the new date with the date constructor. We'll set the audio URL to uploading just like we did for our image URL before we had uploaded that file, and we'll also set the audio name. Just like uploading our image, we want to use the upload bytes function and create a ref with storage. So we'll make sure to import upload bytes, ref, and storage. And the ref is going to be in the audio folder, so audio/audio name, and making sure that we're in the upload bytes function. We'll pass a second argument of audio file. After that, we'll again get the download URL, and we'll pass the same ref to that without the audio file. Here is where we're going to get the URL back, and we can finally update the document with update doc and create a doc reference to rooms, room ID, messages, and new doc ID, remembering once again that we get the new document back from add doc, so we can reference the newly created ID there. And then as the second argument to update doc, we're going to update the URL, audio URL from uploading to the URL that we get back from get download URL. And finally, we're going to create another function of audio input change. This is going to be connected to our input here via an on change. So that'll be set to audio input change, this hidden input. We're going to get an event there, and we're going to do something very similar where we will grab the audio file from event.target.files, the 0th element. We'll get the audio name from nano ID. We'll make sure to import that. And if we have an audio file, we're going to set audio ID to an empty string, and we will send audio as well, passing through the audio file and audio name. So with all of that, we can attempt to record some sort of audio message. I'm going to record something for 5 seconds here, and then I'm going to click the check mark, and we see we're getting an error, and this is because I didn't add a closing parenthesis in the right place. It should be around the doc reference, so it should look like this. And once that's fixed, let me try recording something else for 2 seconds. Hit the check mark icon, and we see that we didn't get an error. Let's check our storage. If we go to storage, we see audio. We see a couple of audio files here. That's good. They're of different sizes because they're of different lengths. We see that they're of type audio/MPEG. We can download the file that if we like to test it. I feel pretty confident that it's being uploaded correctly. The only improvement that we need to make is to complete the audio player, which we'll take care of in the next lesson. The last step of recording audio is to actually be able to play it back. So right now we don't have a working audio player, but we know for a fact that we've successfully uploaded these audio files. And if we check our database and we go to our rooms, we can see if we find the audio, the one with the audio name and audio URL, it was uploaded correctly. However, we need to be able to play it. So to fix that, we're going to go into our chat messages component. And if we go back to chat, we look for chat messages. We're passing down all the data that we need, all 5 of these props. And let's make sure we're destructuring everything. Room ID, audio ID, set audio ID. Make sure that we have all of these props and that we have our imported audio player. If we just head down to where we have this self-closing div, if we have an audio name, we want to display the audio player where we're going to pass down some props such as sender, and that is if sender is true, and we're the person that sent the audio message. We're going to pass down the prop room ID, the ID of the message from message.id, along with the audio URL set to message.audio URL, audio ID from props, and set audio ID. And keep in mind that this audio player component was one that we imported from our assets folder, so we did not have to create any of this. So provided that you included all of that, we can check and see if this works. Our first message does not work because that wasn't uploaded properly, as we saw. We can go ahead and we figure out which one that is. We just delete both of these. Oh, it's this one because we have audio URL set to uploading, so we'll delete this document. We see it's immediately updated, so we are getting real-time data. Any changes that we make in our database are immediately applied, so it is a real-time chat. And we can go ahead and play our audio here. We can go to a different part of it. You can't hear the audio that I'm listening to, but it is recorded correctly. Feel free to confirm this on your own. But with that, we now have audio messages that our user can play along with the text and image messages that we've already sent. The last major feature to finish before we consider our chat app complete is the ability to delete a room. We're going to be able to do so with the help of this menu. We see that it's not currently opening, so we're going to begin with that by heading back to our chat component. And remember that we had up at the top this menu that should be toggled with this icon button. To fix this, we're going to create a couple of pieces of state. One is going to be with a default value of null, and we're going to call this open menu and setter set open menu, and we'll have another piece of state to determine when we're deleting a room, and it's going to be called is deleting, and the setter set deleting. We'll begin by heading down to our icon button with the icon more vert, and we want to add an on click where we will take the event and we want to call set open menu with the current target from event.currentTarget. We're going to use that reference to a DOM element in our menu component, and we're going to use it on a prop called anchor element. This is used to set the position of the menu. We'll set anchor element to open menu, the element stored in that piece of state, and we're going to have an open prop where if we have this element in state, we're going to consider our menu open. So we'll say not open menu, and we'll replace our hard-coded open value of false. And if we want to close this menu, similar to how our dialog worked, we want to call a callback where we set open menu to null. Open menu to null. If we go back to our header, we should be able to toggle this menu and see its contents, our one item here of delete room. We want to be able to click this to delete a room. So we'll add an on click and connect it to a new function, delete room, which we'll create above our conditional here. This will be an async function delete room, where at the beginning we want to set open menu to null to hide the menu when we're in the process of deleting, and we want to set deleting to true. The reason for this is when set deleting is true, we want to display at the very bottom, if is deleting is true, we want to return some JSX, specifically a div, and this is going to have the class chat deleting, and this will include a circular progress component. So to just test this briefly, if we wanted to delete our room, we'd see a big circle progress. You see the opacity is lightened. So this is what we'll see when we're in the process of deleting a given room. Let's reload, and the rest of the contents of delete room is going to be some logic to figure out how to delete not only a reference to the room collection, but also all of its documents, meaning its messages, as well as its image and audio files. Additionally, we want to remove all of the chats on the chats subcollection of users. We want to get rid of those as well. So we're going to need to create several refs here, and we want to do all of this deleting in at the same time. We want to make sure that all of these promises are resolved successfully, all of these async operations. So we're specifically going to be using promise.all to do so. But the first step is to set up all of the refs and to figure out how to delete everything, because we haven't deleted anything just yet. We'll make sure to set everything up within a try catch. We will catch any errors, and we want to console log error deleting room. We'll actually use a console error and insert the error message as the second argument to see what went wrong, if anything. Finally, if it resolves successfully or not, we want to set deleting to false and hide that spinner. And in the try part, we're first going to get a reference to all of the user chats according to the room ID. So we're going to make a user chats ref set to doc, pass in the DB, and this will be to users / user ID / chats / room ID. That's one ref. We're going to need a ref to the room itself. So this will be a document, and the path will be to rooms / room ID. We're going to have a collection ref. So this is going to be the room messages ref. We'll use the collection function, and it'll be to rooms / room ID / messages, that sub collection. And we want to use this ref in order to get all of the individual documents and then delete them individually. We can do so with get docs, as we already know. And for this, we need to assemble a query, which we need to import as well, and then pass in the room messages ref. This allows us to get back the room messages. And we're going to create two arrays here. We're going to have one for audio files. This will be an empty array, and one for image files. We're going to kind of separate them in the process of deleting them. We want to take all of the room messages .docs, and for each doc, we want to iterate over this and say if it has doc.data, make sure to call this as a method, .audio name, if it has that field, we know that we're working with an audio file, so we want to take the audio files array and push onto it doc.data.audio name. We just need a reference. We're going to use this audio name to create a reference to then delete it from Firebase storage. Else if we have doc.data.image name, you know that we have an image file. So in that case, we would say image files.push.doc.data.image name. So we're storing references, or at least the file names for both of these sets of files. And now we're in a position to delete everything. This allows us to say await promise.all, and promise.all accepts an array of promises that it will resolve and hopefully resolve all of them successfully. We don't want one failing, so this is why we're using promise.all to help us out a little bit and make sure that they all resolve successfully or not, or it throws an error. We want to delete doc. We're going to use the delete doc function, which we haven't used before. It's going to take a reference and nothing else. It's really simple. It needs a document reference, as you would imagine, for this function. We're going to pass in the user chats ref, and we're also going to delete the room ref, which is also a doc reference. Then after that, we want to delete the individual documents for the room messages. To do that, since we need to spread all of these promises into promise.all, we're going to need to spread in room messages.docs.map, and we're going to map over each of the documents and convert it into a promise. We're not going to await it. We're just going to say delete doc.ref, just like this. So we're spreading in all of those individual promises to delete the docs, the room message docs individually. And we're going to do something similar for the image and audio files. We're going to spread in image files.map, where for each image, to delete an image, we're going to use a function called delete object from Firebase storage. And this also just has a storage ref. We need to create one, however, using ref from Firebase/storage. We'll pass in storage and then a reference, a full reference to the path to find the image on images/, and then the image name is going to be provided as an individual element on the image files array. So now we're returning a promise to delete all of our image files individually using this created ref. And we can do the same thing for audio files. We'll map over that, get our audio file, and the ref that we need to make will start with the path audio/audio. And again, this just means the image name and the audio name. Let's save all of that and then head back to our room that we want to delete. Let's make sure that we don't have any errors, and we will attempt to delete it. We'll go up to the top, hit delete room, and everything's gone. Our chats are gone. Now that was for a private conversation, so it didn't delete the entire room, it just deleted everything in the room. For a room itself, however, we're going to delete the room. Just to clarify, for a private conversation, this room will still exist. For a public room, this will not. So if we were to type something, it doesn't matter what, and then hit delete room, that whole room will go away. So at this point, we have a fully functional chat app. We can create new public rooms. We can have private conversations with people, and we can nuke the entire conversation. We can delete everything in it, and we're ready to push this to the web for people to use. Before we push our app to the web, we need to touch on one thing to make sure unauthenticated users don't have access to our application, meaning that they can't just take our keys, everything that's exposed on the client, and everything that's in our firebase.js file, because that's on the client and that's all accessible to other people. We need to set up some rules within our Firebase console to make sure that our storage, our Firestore database, all of that's locked down, and only authenticated users can interact with it and read data from it and write data to it. For both Firestore and storage, they come with rules. We can write rules in the Firebase console in order to specify the level of access that our users are going to have. If we start with Firestore and we go to the Rules tab, you'll see that we have read and write access. This is what this says. It allows read and write access if the request time, the request that's made to the database, is less than this particular date. Again, we just used a test mode. When building our app, we allowed read and write access to everyone. We don't want to do that in production. We only want read and write access to our authenticated users. So we can simply write here, we can modify this rule and just say allow read and write, and we kind of write rules in a syntax similar to JavaScript. It looks vaguely familiar, looks vaguely reminiscent of JavaScript. We can say if request, the request that comes in, .auth, and you'll see that we have some autocomplete here so we can get an idea of what possible rules Firestore will allow. We just want to allow read and write access if request.auth is not equal to null. This just means if it's an authenticated request, if it's not an unauthenticated request, we're going to allow users to read data, to use the chat, and to add chat messages. Once you write that, we can just hit publish, and we can do the same thing for storage. We can go to our storage rules tab. You can see that we can write the identical rule if request.auth does not equal to null, making sure to end this in a semicolon, that we don't have any errors. We can hit publish, and now we're in a position where we at least have some basic rules. And of course, you can get a lot more precise with the rules in Firebase. We're not going to go into depth on how to write these rules. I'm sure that you can think of some more sophisticated rules that you might want to have for your app. This is just the bare minimum that we need when you're deploying any Firebase app to make sure that users don't take advantage of it in production. We've locked down our application, and now we're ready to deploy it to the web. To do so, we can head to Build and then Hosting. To get started with hosting, again, we'll click the Get Started button, and we're going to be given some instructions to install the Firebase CLI in our terminal. So you'll want to copy this command, and we'll head to our terminal once again, and we'll run it, we'll paste it in, and we'll run this to install Firebase tools. You might get an error because you'll need to run it with sudo as a super user and provide your computer's password. Once that's installed successfully, we can move on to the next step, and we're going to need to sign in to Firebase using the Firebase tools CLI. So we'll run Firebase login, and currently I'm logged in. I'll just log out quickly just so we can go through this step together. When you run Firebase login, you can choose to allow it to collect CLI and emulator suite usage and error reporting information. That's totally up to you. I'm going to say no, and we want to log in with the account that we created our project with, and we want to allow Firebase CLI to access all this stuff. We'll hit allow, and we'll see that we've logged in successfully. We can close that page. We'll see that we've logged in, and we can now run the command Firebase init. So we want to initialize our Firebase project using Firebase tools. Here we need to choose which resources that we're using, which services we're using from Firebase, and we know which ones we have used. We're going to choose storage, and by the way, you just need to hit the space bar. You'll use the arrow keys to go through these different options and hit the space bar to select them. We've used storage, Firestore, as well as hosting, and we'll choose this option, hosting, configure files for Firebase hosting. We want to select that and hit enter. Unless you've deployed this before, we want to use an existing project, and we'll choose the one that we created at the beginning, hit enter. It's going to set up Firestore by creating a few files for us where our Firestore rules are going to be saved. So this is especially useful to keep track of what rules that we're using so that they're all included in our code base and they're not in two different places that we have to keep track of. You can always sync them using this file. So we'll just hit enter. We don't have any indexes, but you can hit enter as well. And the hosting setup, what you see right here, these are the important steps that we need to follow. To configure Next.js for Firebase hosting, for Firebase to actually deploy our website, our web app, we just need to go to package.json and add a new script. We're going to add a script called export, and this is going to allow us to export our project as a bunch of static files. And this is possible because we're not using any of Next.js's data fetching functions such as get static props, get static paths, and get server side props. So we can just export this to a folder called out, and it includes all of the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript that we need, and to use a static hosting service like Firebase hosting to run our app as a single page application. For this, we need to build our project with next build and then run next export. This is what's going to take care of exporting our entire project as static files. So before we do anything else, we are going to open one more terminal, or we can actually kill the first terminal where we are running our project in development, and now run npm run export. It's going to build our project with the next build command and then run next export. That's what this and does, is it'll run one script and then the next one. At the end of that, you should see export successful. If you scroll up, you can see the first load JS and see how much JavaScript we're shipping to our users. We just have one page, so it's all of our bundled JavaScript is just going to be on the index page. If you scroll up a little bit more, you'll see a bunch of warnings, and this is coming from ESLint. We can disable these warnings because, as I mentioned at the beginning of building this app, we're not going to use next image because we don't have a server. Next image requires a server. So to disable this, we're going to need to change our eslint.json file. If you want to get rid of these warnings, that is, if they don't bother you, that's not a problem. If you ever want to change any rules to an eslint, you can see this is the eslint.rc.json file. We add a rules object, and on it we can just specify that we want to ignore a rule. You can see it listed at the bottom here that this first rule and only rule that we're violating is this next no image element. To turn that off, we just need to add that as a key, the name of the rule that we want to disable, and set its value to off. So if we save that and clear out our logs and run that again, npm run export, you'll see that as it went through the linting step, we didn't get any of those warnings anymore. And once again, all of those files have been put in the out folder. We're going to go back to our other terminal, and we're going to select that we want the public directory where all of our static files are located are not in public. That's not what it is. We want our built folder to be out, not public. So make sure to type that in and hit enter. We want to configure this as a single page app and rewrite all URLs to index.html. We'll select yes. We can set up automatic builds and deploys with GitHub. This is something that you can do if you want to sync to track all of your files with Git and GitHub. I'm going to say no. And it's going to tell us that this file already exists. Overwrite, you want to make sure that you say no. So we'll say no for that. And then it'll go through the storage setup. It's going to allow us to keep track of our storage rules. We'll just hit enter. Then everything, all of those different resources are going to be set up. All of our files are going to be created. So we've initialized Firebase with hosting, storage, and Firestore. The last step that we need to take to actually push our app to the web is just run the command Firebase deploy. You'll see that it spent a few seconds uploading those files, and then almost immediately we're given this hosting URL, so we can command click and open that, and we see our app working just like we would expect. Of course, we can sign in. We're taken to the app page. We don't see really any content, but if we add messages, we can add messages, we can add images. And for whatever reason, if you're getting this error, user does not have permission to access images / whatever, it might be because of an error with Firebase storage. Just make sure and take a look at your rules and make sure it's set to the right thing. When you change that, you should be able to upload files to storage and see them displayed, as well as our audio recordings. Thank you so much for taking this course. I really hope you enjoyed making this chat app. Feel free to extend it however you like, add more features, and use this built project in your portfolio for job applications. Use it as the start of your own business. I hope you learned a ton in this course. Thanks so much for building this project with me. We really did a lot, and I hope to see you in the next epic project.